Somewhere in central Turkey, there's a hole in the ground that swallows an entire city. Not a metaphor, not an exaggeration, an actual city carved downward instead of upward, stretching an estimated 18 stories beneath the surface, deep enough to hold as many as 20,000 people at once, along with their livestock, their food stores, their chapels, their wells. 20,000 human beings choosing to live in the dark in the earth, below the roots of the trees growing above their heads. And the question that should keep you up at night, if this weren't designed to help you sleep, is simple. What were they so afraid of that this seemed like the better option? That's what we're digging into tonight, literally. Before we go down there, let's set some ground rules. Everything I tell you in this episode is going to be rooted in what archaeologists and historians actually know, the excavated chambers, the carbon-dated tools, the written records that survive. But I'll be honest with you up front. Some of this story lives in the gaps, the places where the evidence goes quiet and historians are left making educated guesses. When that happens, I'll tell you, I'm not interested in feeding you certainty, where certainty doesn't exist. I'm interested in the truth, even when the truth is we don't fully know. Now, if you're listening to this to drift off, that's exactly the point. So tell me in the comments, where are you right now? And what time is it where you are? I love checking these in the morning and seeing London at midnight, Manila at breakfast, Toronto somewhere in between. It's a strange, quiet kind of connection, all of us scattered across time zones, listening to the same story about people who lived scattered across time itself. And if you want these without any ads breaking the spell, without music cutting through the narration, find this show on Spotify and hit follow. It's the cleanest way to listen, especially if you're trying to fall asleep. A 5-star review helps more than you'd think too. Links in the description if you want it. Okay, let's orient ourselves. The place we're talking about is called Derinkuyu, in the Cappadocia region of Turkey, a landscape so strange it looks like it belongs on another planet. Soft volcanic rock, twisted into cones and pillars by centuries of wind and rain, hiding underneath it something even stranger. Derinkuyu isn't alone either. It's connected, at least in theory, to a wider network of underground refuges scattered across the region, tunnels linking one hidden settlement to another, like some kind of ancient subway system built for emergencies nobody was supposed to talk about. 18 stories down, 20,000 people, ventilation shafts. Wells, stables for animals, massive circular doors, carved like millstones, that could seal a corridor from the inside in seconds. This wasn't a cave people stumbled into and decided to stay in for a night. This was engineered, planned, built with intention, by people who understood exactly what they needed to survive whatever was coming. So what were they preparing for? Invaders? Empires? Something in the sky, something in the ground, something in each other? To answer that, we need to start at the very beginning. Not with the tunnels themselves, but with the land above them, a place so bizarre in its geology that it practically invited people to disappear beneath it. Picture a map of Turkey in your mind. Find the middle of it, the interior, far from the coastlines, far from the postcard beaches. That's Anatolia, the ancient heartland of a dozen different empires, and tucked into its centre is a region called Cappadocia. If you've ever seen photographs of hot air balloons drifting over a landscape that looks like something from a dream, cone-shaped rock towers, pale valleys, formations that seem to defy the normal rules of erosion, that's here. That's the surface world we're starting with tonight, because you can't understand what's underneath without understanding what's on top. Millions of years ago, this region sat in the shadow of several massive volcanoes. Erskies, Hassan and others, now quiet, now just mountains on the horizon, but once upon a time actively reshaping the world around them. These volcanoes didn't just erupt once. They erupted repeatedly over vast stretches of geological time, burying the landscape again and again under layers of ash and lava. That ash, compressed over millennia, hardened into something called tuff, a volcanic rock that would end up defining everything about how humans lived here for thousands of years. Now, tuff is a strange material. It's rock, technically, but it doesn't behave like the granite or limestone most of us picture when we hear that word. Fresh from the ground, tuff is soft. Soft enough that you can carve it with basic hand tools, soft enough that a person with patience and a chisel could shape a room out of it in a matter of days rather than months. But here's the part that made all the difference. Once that tuff is exposed to air, it begins to harden. It cures almost like clay in a kiln, becoming stable enough to support the weight of tunnels, chambers, entire floors stacked on top of each other. Soft enough to carve, strong enough to hold. It's hard to imagine a material better suited for building a civilization underground, and it's almost suspicious how perfectly it lines up with what the people of Cappadocia eventually did with it. Above ground, this same volcanic history created the landscape's most famous feature, the fairy chimneys, tall, narrow spires of rock, some of them looking almost sculpted, capped with a harder stone that protected the softer tuff beneath from washing away in the rain. Entire valleys are filled with them, standing in clusters, some hollowed out over the centuries into homes, dovcotes, storage rooms. If you walked through this region 1,000 years ago, you might have seen doorways cut directly into these formations, smoke curling out of what looked like solid rock. And that's really the key thing to understand about Cappadocia's surface. It was never just decoration, it was infrastructure hiding in plain sight. Because here's the detail that matters most for our story tonight. Many of the entrances to the underground world were disguised, sometimes intentionally, sometimes just by the natural chaos of the terrain. A hole in a hillside, a gap behind a rock formation, an opening that looked like nothing more than a shepherd's shelter. Easy to miss if you didn't know exactly where to look, and even easier to seal off and forget if you needed to disappear in a hurry. The landscape itself provided the perfect camouflage for something far larger hiding just beneath it. Then there's the climate, which gives us another clue about why people were drawn underground in the first place. Cappadocia sits at a high elevation, and its weather swings hard between extremes. Summers can be brutally hot, temperatures climbing well past anything comfortable. Winters, on the other hand, bring biting cold snow winds that cut through anything less than heavy wool. It's a punishing rhythm, season after season, year after year. But underground, a few meters below the surface, the temperature barely moves at all. It settles into a steady, almost unnervingly consistent range, cool in summer, mild in winter, regardless of what chaos is happening above. For anyone trying to survive long-term in a place like this, that kind of natural climate control isn't a luxury. It's a lifeline. So when you put all of this together, the volcanic geology, the soft but stable tuff, the hidden natural entrances, the punishing surface climate, you start to see why Cappadocia practically invited people underground. The land seems almost designed for it, like some strange collaboration between geology and necessity. But here's the thing we have to be honest about. Geography alone doesn't explain a city 18 stories deep, built to hold 20,000 people. Plenty of places in the world have soft rock and harsh weather, and none of them ended up looking like this. The land gave people an opportunity. It did not force their hand. Something else did that. Something historical, something human, something we're only beginning to piece together as we go deeper, quite literally, into the story of what was actually built down there, and why. If you've ever heard about Cappadocia's underground cities, you've probably heard the same headline number repeated over and over. A city 18 stories deep, sheltering 20,000 people. It's the kind of phrase that lodges in the mind. 18 stories. 20,000 souls. It sounds like someone flipped a modern skyscraper upside down and buried it. But underground, stories don't work the way they do above ground. And 20,000 people doesn't mean what most people imagine either. Let's start with depth. When people talk about 18 levels, they're usually talking about Derinkuyu, the most famous of Cappadocia's underground complexes. Archaeologists and surveyors generally agree that from the highest known level to the lowest explored chamber, you're looking at something like 60 to 80 meters of vertical range. In modern building terms, that might translate roughly to 18 normal floors. But the underground doesn't stack neatly. Some levels are more like broad terraces, a warren of rooms spreading out horizontally at roughly the same depth. Some are only a few chambers connected by narrow passages, a sort of half-level between more substantial floors. And unlike a tower, where each floor is a clean slice above the one beneath, underground levels can overlap, step, split, and reconnect in ways that make the idea of simple counting a little misleading. So, when you hear 18 stories, what you're really hearing is a kind of shorthand. It means up to 18 recognizable tiers of human-carved space, reachable through a sequence of stairways and tunnels. Not 18 perfectly aligned floors like an office building. More like 18 plateaus on a very complicated internal cliff. Now, what about those 20,000 people? This number gets repeated so often it feels authoritative, but when you track it back, it's less a hard measurement and more an educated guess that stuck. Archaeologists don't find a sign at the entrance that says maximum occupancy, 20,000. They work it out from clues. One way is simple space. You take the rooms we know about, you estimate average floor area, you ask how many bodies could actually lie down here, or sit, or sleep in shifts, without turning the place into a crush of overheating, suffocating humanity. That gives you one number, but space on its own is deceptive. You could, in theory, pack far more people into the rooms than the system could realistically support. So researchers layer other limits on top. How much food storage space is there? How many storage chambers? How big? What kinds of jars or niches have been found there? How many animals could be kept in the carved stables without the air turning poisonous? How many people can breathe comfortably through the available ventilation shafts? Ventilation is one of the key constraints. Derinkuyu has a major central shaft that doubles as both airflow and, in some areas, water access. Smaller ventilation channels branch out, some of them cleverly disguised. But air doesn't magically multiply because you carved more beds. If too many people seal themselves underground, carbon dioxide builds up, fires struggle to burn, and people start to feel dizzy, then sick. So any population estimate has to ask not just how many people fit, but how many people can the air support, especially with oil lamps, cooking fires, animals and human bodies all competing for oxygen. Animals themselves are another variable. Those stables weren't decorative. If a community took refuge underground, valuable livestock came with them, sheep, goats, maybe cattle, possibly even horses or donkeys. Each of those animals takes up floor space, consumes fodder, and breathes the same air. So every hoof included in the model means fewer human feet. When you put all this together, archaeologists end up with a range. At the high end, if you assume that every excavated room was in active use, that the undiscovered parts mirror what we've found, that people slept in shifts and accepted crowding because the alternative was death on the surface. You can imagine numbers approaching the famous 20,000. At the low end, if you assume more comfortable spacing, shorter periods of continuous occupation, and some rooms reserved for storage or ritual rather than housing, the realistic figure shrinks significantly. And then there's the biggest complication of all: we haven't seen the whole picture. Many lower levels are blocked by collapse, by centuries of infill, or by deliberate sealing. Some tunnels simply vanish into rockfall, others were plugged with stone discs, then later buried by soil and debris. Ground-penetrating radar and limited exploration suggest that some complexes extend beyond the currently accessible plans. There may be entire spurs of rooms and corridors we've never mapped, or shafts that once connected separate clusters into a larger system. On top of that, use changed over time. These spaces weren't carved in a single campaign and then frozen. Early phases may have been small, closer to simple refuges or cool storage areas. Centuries later, new threats or new populations might have expanded them, deepened them, repurposed older rooms, blocked some passages, opened others. A level that begins its life as a storage floor might, generations later, become sleeping space, while another area is turned into a chapel, or a wine cellar, or an animal pen. So any single occupancy figure pretends that 1,000 years of shifting usage can be flattened into one static moment, which we know isn't true. All of this is why responsible scholars tend to talk in careful language. On the order of thousands, possibly up to tens of thousands in emergency conditions. They distinguish between maximum theoretical capacity, the absolute upper bound if every chamber was filled, every shaft fully exploited, and the likely real-world numbers which were probably lower and fluctuated from crisis to crisis, decade to decade. For our purposes tonight, as we wander through this underground city in our imaginations, it helps to set a cautious baseline, not a buried metropolis where 20,000 people lived their entire lives like ants in a nest, generation after generation, but a flexible refuge system, a place where several thousand people from the surrounding area could disappear for days, weeks, maybe months when danger loomed. A place whose deeper levels might only have been used in the worst moments, when the cost of going farther down, less light, poorer air, tighter quarters, was worth paying to avoid what was happening above. Keep that in mind as we move forward. When we talk about the city, we're really talking about a layered, shifting space, sometimes half empty, sometimes crowded to its architectural limits. Not a fantasy megastructure, but something more interesting, a human-built safety net whose full extent we still haven't completely untangled. And that uncertainty, that sense that there's more in the dark than we can quite measure, is exactly what makes the next part of the story so strange. Because for a very long time, no one on the surface was even supposed to know this world existed at all. For centuries, that secrecy mostly held. Local families in Cappadocia knew there were old places under certain houses. Cellars that went a little too far, cool stone rooms where you could store grain or wine and feel the air move softly past your face, as if the hill itself were breathing. Stories circulated about tunnels linking one village to another, about the old people who had carved them and the times long ago when everyone packed up and went below. But these weren't the kinds of stories that made it into imperial archives or grand chronicles. To people who lived with them, the underground spaces were practical, not exotic. They were part pantry, part shelter, part inherited nuisance when a wall needed repairing and the floor suddenly rang hollow. The modern story of discovery really begins when outsiders start paying systematic attention. In the 19th century, European travellers and missionaries passing through central Anatolia noticed odd things: chimney-like rock towers that were obviously inhabited, cave churches decorated with fading frescoes, and rumours of deeper cavities that villagers were reluctant to show. A few accounts mention subterranean towns, but usually in passing, with little detail. The focus then was on the picturesque surface, fairy chimneys, painted chapels, a Bible landscape you could photograph. Serious documentation had to wait until the 20th century when Turkish scholars and officials began investigating more carefully. Even then, the big breakthroughs weren't always planned. One of the most famous stories, probably embellished in the retelling, but basically plausible, describes a homeowner in the town of Derinkuyu renovating a house in the 1960s. He knocks out a wall to expand a room, and finds not solid rock, but a narrow opening into darkness. Behind it, a descending passage. Behind that, another room. Then another, then a staircase. Bit by bit, with help from neighbours and officials, the opening reveals something much larger than a forgotten cellar, the upper levels of what would soon be called an underground city. Once that door in the wall appears, the logic changes. Curiosity becomes policy. Archaeologists, engineers and government agencies step in. The first surveys of Derinkuyu and neighbouring sites are cautious, partial, and, by necessity, a little improvised. Early teams worked with what they could see and safely access. They mapped obvious corridors, counted rooms, traced major shafts. Plans were drawn by hand, measurements taken in tight confines with simple tools. The goal wasn't to produce a complete, three-dimensional model of the voids under the town. It was to answer more basic questions. How extensive is this? Is it stable? Can it be opened to the public without killing anyone? In that process, a lot was captured and a lot was missed. What they did record, surprisingly well, were the main circulation routes and large rooms, the broad stairways, the central ventilation shafts, identifiable chapels, stables, communal spaces. These are the features that stand out when you move through the complex and the ones that matter most. If your immediate concern is, where could crowds walk and where are the obvious dangers? What they couldn't fully track were the small things, narrow side galleries that vanish into sediment, short vertical chimneys choked with debris, passages that pinch down to the width of a single shoulder. Many of those were simply left for later. Some were sealed deliberately, both for safety and to keep visitors from wandering into dead ends. It's easy, reading those early reports, to think in terms of clean lines and finished plans. But underground work rarely looks like that in practice. Conditions are cramped, air can be stale, visibility is limited. Even today, with better lighting and instrumentation, explorers have to move carefully. The safety realities are sobering. These spaces are carved into relatively soft volcanic tuff, a rock that is wonderfully easy to shape and, under the wrong conditions, worryingly easy to fracture. Centuries of water, seepage, earthquakes and surface construction have weakened some areas. Ceilings can flake, columns can sprawl. A chamber that has stood quietly for 1,000 years might be one careless vibration away from partial collapse. Then there's the air. Ventilation shafts do an impressive job for what they are, but they were designed for intermittent, managed use, not endless streams of modern tourists. In deep or poorly connected pockets, oxygen can fall and carbon dioxide can rise to levels that make people lightheaded long before they notice anything is wrong. Dust from feet and clothing hangs in the air. Old bat guano, fine rock powder, and modern pollution combine into something your lungs do not appreciate. Because of this, archaeologists and engineers often work with gas meters and strict time limits. Some branches are only entered briefly, others are avoided altogether. Not because they aren't interesting, but because they simply aren't safe enough yet. Every new meter explored is a calculated trade-off between knowledge and risk. Overlay this with tourism and you get a complicated picture. On one hand, opening parts of Derinkuyu, Kaymakli, and other sites to visitors has brought money, attention, and an incentive to preserve what's visible. Paths are shored up. Ceilings are reinforced. Electrical lighting replaces open flames. Conservation work stabilizes walls that might otherwise crumble quietly away from neglect. On the other hand, tourism shapes what we think these places are. Public circuits tend to highlight the big dramatic features, the rolling stone doors, the long communal corridors, the chapels and wine presses. Subtler areas, awkward corners, constricted shafts, small storerooms whose function is uncertain are bypassed or closed. Heavy traffic encourages smoothing floors, widening tight spots, even subtly reshaping the carved surfaces to meet safety codes. Research teams, when they come in, are often working in the shadows of these decisions. They may get special access after hours, or to locked sections, but they're still moving within a network that has been partially re-engineered for tourism. Meanwhile, other sections are deliberately sealed to everyone. If a passage undercuts modern foundations, or if a chamber lies beneath a busy road with questionable support, it may be walled off and left as a blank on the map. And beyond the ticket gates, beyond the famous names, the landscape is full of hints that more lies below. Cappadocia's soft rock invites human tinkering. Farmers digging a new cistern hit a void. A construction crew cutting a trench for a water pipe breaks into an ancient corridor. A shepherd notices cool air breathing out of a crack in summer heat. Each of these accidents can be the first clue to yet another carved space, another cluster of rooms, another tunnel system whose last deliberate footsteps might have been 1,000 years ago. Modern tools, ground-penetrating radar, 3D laser scanning, better dating techniques help, but they don't turn the underground into a fully transparent world. Radar struggles in complex, layered geology. Scanners need line of sight, which you only have once you're already inside. Much of what we know still begins the way it did for that homeowner in Derinkuyu, with an unexpected hole where solid rock was supposed to be. This is why even now you sometimes see headlines about new underground cities found in Cappadocia. Often they're not entirely new. They're forgotten or partial spaces being recognised, for the first time in centuries as part of a larger pattern. A little cellar that turns out to be a stairway, a short tunnel that aligns suspiciously well with another town's old place. So when we talk about Derinkuyu or any other complex, as if it were fully mapped, that's a polite fiction. We have good plans of the sections we can safely reach. We have educated guesses about how far they might extend. And we have a landscape riddled with hidden voids, where every renovation, every pipe trench, every curious farmer has a non-zero chance of nudging the story open a little further. It's in that half-known world, part measured, part imagined, that we can start to ask a different kind of question. Not just how big is it, or how many people fit, but how did they carve this at all? What kind of work it took? What tools they used, and how many lifetimes were spent turning raw rock into refuge? If you stand in one of those low rooms and run your fingers over the walls, you can still feel the work. The rock here is forgiving. Cappadocian tuff is a compressed volcanic ash, soft enough that you can scratch it with a nail, yet strong enough, in thick masses, to hold its shape for centuries. That combination is the whole reason any of this is possible. You don't need bronze drills or iron saws to make a space in it. A determined group with stone hammers and patience can hollow out a room. The surfaces remember that. On some walls you see wide, shallow scallops where pick-like tools were swung in rhythmic arcs. Elsewhere, parallel striations show where flat chisels bit down in orderly rows. In certain corridors the ceiling bears the black bloom of ancient soot, testifying to a time when light meant fire and air quality was something you managed by instinct, not instrumentation. Over the long life of these complexes, the tools changed. Early phases, if, as many suspect, some roots go back as far as the late Bronze or early Iron Age, would have been cut with stone and simple metal, hard cobbles, copper, or early bronze tips, then iron chisels and wedges as those became common. You don't see the gleam of a technological revolution so much as a quiet thickening of capability. Iron makes the work faster. Sharper chisels mean neater corners, smoother arches, finer control. But the basic technique stays the same. Mark out a line, chip a groove, deepen it, prise out chunks of rock, repeat. Now imagine what that process looks like over time. You don't stand at the surface and decide in one generation to create an 18-story ant farm. You start with what you need: a cool, dry cellar, a little bigger than last year's, a short refuge tunnel between neighbouring houses, a stable carved into the slope where animals can shelter from winter wind. Each of those projects produces spoil, waste rock that has to go somewhere. Here the secrecy problem appears. If you're carving a hiding place, you don't want an obvious pile of freshly dumped tuff announcing it. One solution is simple dispersion. The rock they're cutting is the same material the landscape erodes from naturally. Broken into small enough pieces, it looks like ordinary scree. You can mix it into terraced fields, use it to build low walls, spread it along paths. Over years it becomes part of the background noise of stone and dust. Another solution is internal dumping. Not every passage has to remain open forever. Dead ends, abandoned side chambers, early rooms made obsolete by better ones. They make excellent spoil repositories. You carve forward, dump backward, gradually plugging older, less useful sections with debris. From the surface there's no new mound, no scar underground. The network thickens in some places and quietly suffocates in others. In deeper levels, the problem shifts from secrecy to logistics. You can't easily haul baskets of rock up a narrow stairway clogged with people, so you stage it. Workers chip at the face, fill containers, pass them back along a human chain to an intermediate chamber, then on again to an exit or a dump. It's slow, repetitive work, punctuated by the constant need to think about what happens if the rock decides it's had enough. Because the enemy here isn't just effort, it's gravity. Carving a void inside a mass of tuff is like whittling the insides of a bone. Take too much in the wrong place, and the whole structure can crack. So the carvers left bones behind, thick pillars of untouched rock, ridges along ceilings, solid walls between adjacent rooms. In many chambers, the ceiling is gently arched, not flat. That isn't an aesthetic flourish, it's structural logic. Curves distribute stress, sharp corners, concentrated. Some of these features look almost architectural in the formal sense: columns with squared edges, barrel vault ceilings carefully smoothed. Others are more pragmatic, awkward, lumpy supports left because the rock there felt weak or sounded wrong under the hammer. Over generations, rule-of-thumb engineering principles emerge. Don't line up too many big rooms directly above each other. Don't cut away every rib between parallel corridors. Don't trust a thin roof, however solid it seems. Water complicates everything. Tuff drinks moisture. If you open into an unexpected fracture that carries runoff, or break into the side of an aquifer-fed shaft, you can suddenly find your new room taking on water. At best, that makes a nuisance. At worst, it destabilizes ceilings, turns floors to mud, and telegraphs your presence to the surface with damp patches and subsidence. So whoever planned expansions had to read the rock and the hydrology. Wells were usually sunk carefully from secure points, often from higher levels, straight down into stable water-bearing layers. Once a clean shaft existed. Later, carvers tried to avoid cutting into it from the side, both to prevent contamination and to keep from draining or flooding occupied spaces. You see channels cut into floors to divert seepage along predictable paths, small sumps where water can collect harmlessly, and deliberate high thresholds at room entrances to keep any sudden flow from racing through the whole level. In some places, promising but too wet galleries seem to have been simply abandoned. Half-finished cuts, then a decision that the risk wasn't worth it. Stack all of this together, the tools, the spoil, the supports, the water, and the labour question becomes less mysterious. A single team of workers couldn't have hollowed out Derinkuyu as we see it today, not in their lifetimes. But if you break the project into centuries of accretion, it starts to feel almost ordinary. Each generation inherits a pattern of spaces, modifies it slightly, pushes a little deeper here, widens a corridor there, links to a neighbour's refuge, abandons an inconvenient branch, fills another with waste. Work likely concentrated in times of stress. Rumours of an approaching army, a new tax collector, raiders on the plains. Suddenly the priority shifts from farming and trade to making sure there's one more place to hide, one more choke point, one more back door between families. When the pressure eases, digging slows, people live with what's already carved, learn its quirks, patch its weak points. Over long enough spans, those bursts add up. What looks at first glance like a single city designed on a drafting table is, more plausibly, a layered artifact of countless small practical decisions. A kind of geological family tree of labour, branching and twisting under your feet. And once you see it that way, another question comes into focus. It's one thing to carve a refuge. It's another to make it livable, to keep breathing down there, to stop the air from turning stale and deadly when thousands of frightened people pack into the dark. Air is invisible, which makes it easy to forget how hard it is to manage. Derinkuyu and its cousins force you to remember. Down there, the air becomes a thing with weight and direction. It moves or fails to move in ways you can feel on your skin in the back of your throat. And whoever extended these complexes over the centuries learned, sometimes the hard way, that rock alone doesn't keep you alive. Flow does, if you trace the plan of a big Cappadocian underground city. One feature keeps reappearing: narrow, almost perfectly vertical shafts, dropping from the surface through multiple levels. In Derinkuyu, some are nearly 60 metres deep. At first glance, they look like wells, and some of them are, but they're also the lungs of the system. Warm air rises, cool air sinks. You don't need thermodynamics to notice that. You only need a lifetime of walking from a sun-baked courtyard into a cool cellar. The builders exploited that simple gradient. When a vertical shaft connects different temperature zones, hotter near the surface, cooler in the depths, it becomes a pathway for convection. Warm, stale air tends to drift upward. Cooler air, especially if there are lower entrances or side vents, tends to be drawn in to replace it. But this only works if you think in networks, not in single tubes. One shaft is a chimney. Dozens, linked to corridors and chambers at different heights, become a system. Some channels likely acted as primary exhausts, rising from lower communal areas towards the surface. Others cut from intermediate levels would have fed fresh air sideways into living spaces. The slight pressure differences between sunlit openings, shaded courtyards and deep rooms created a slow, continuous breathing. Archaeologists describe seeing narrow, round or square cross-section shafts, often about the width of a person's shoulders, piercing through ceilings and disappearing beyond reach of a lamp's glow. In some complexes, you find small niches or recesses near these verticals, where people might sit or work, taking advantage of the better air. Over time, the rock itself records the pattern. Walls near the best vented shafts show less soot, fewer deposits of fine black dust. Of course, theory and practice don't always match. Pack thousands of people and animals into a hidden space, and the carbon dioxide starts to climb. So does humidity, heat, and the output of every oil lamp and cooking fire. The ventilation network had to do more than keep things from feeling stuffy. It had to keep the atmosphere from becoming toxic. That's where the dual use as wells comes in, and why that dual use was a gamble. Water and air often share paths in porous rock. A deep shaft cut down from the surface might intersect an aquifer or perched water table on its way. If you're lucky, you get a sweet, reliable well right at the heart of your refuge. You can lower a bucket from multiple levels, drink, wash, cook, all without risking a trip outside. But water doesn't just appear, it seeps, it carries microbes, it dissolves minerals. Use a major ventilation shaft as your primary well, and you create a mixing chamber. Vapours rise from the water, contaminants from crowded upper levels, animal droppings, spilled waste, smoke particles can drift back down, settle on the surface, leach into it. In reverse, moisture rising from the well can dampen the shaft walls, increasing the growth of mould and weakening the rock. There's also the strategic risk. An open shaft that reaches the surface is both a lifeline and a vulnerability. If an enemy discovers it, they can poison your water, send smoke or fire down into your refuge, even drop weapons or burning material. Some shafts seem to have been capped or disguised at ground level, hidden in courtyards or under small buildings precisely to reduce that danger. Managing smoke in this environment becomes an art. In the deepest levels, you don't typically see big built hearths with high-suited chimneys. Most cooking seems to have happened on higher floors or in areas with short, dedicated flues to the outside. Down below, light came from small, relatively low smoke sources, oil lamps, fat-burning wicks, maybe glowing coals carried in from elsewhere. Even so, years of use left their mark. Ceilings along main circulation routes, especially under shaft mouths, are blackened. Side rooms, farther from the air currents, often look cleaner. The logic seems to be keep intense fire where you can vent it quickly, keep people where the draft from shafts is steady, but not so strong as to chill them. In some galleries, channels cut along the tops of walls may have helped guide hot air toward vertical exits. Elsewhere, subtle design choices, slightly higher ceilings, rounded corners, little offset alcoves reduce the formation of stagnant eddies where smoke would hang. All of this becomes even more critical in the scenario the builders obsessed over most: danger. When the alarm went out, raiders on the plateau, strange soldiers on the horizon, families didn't file politely to their assigned underground rooms. They rushed in crowds with animals, carts, whatever they could carry. Within hours, levels that normally held a few dozen might hold hundreds. Ventilation, normally adequate, would be pushed to its limits. Defenders, if there were organised defenders, had a few levers they could pull. First, they could control which openings to the surface remained active. Some shafts and entrances could be blocked with stones or wooden plugs, forcing air to take specific routes, avoiding places where smoke or gas might be introduced from above. Others could be opened deliberately, turning them into chimneys when cooking fires had to be lit. Second, they could regulate internal flow. Narrow doorways and short pinch points didn't just serve as defensive bottlenecks for human attackers, they also worked as valves for air movement. Closing a heavy stone door in one corridor and opening a hatch in another would subtly change where drafts went, which areas stayed fresher, which were sacrificed to stagnation in the short term. Third, in an extreme case, they could weaponize the air. Imagine a pursuing force that manages to force its way into the first underground level. If defenders retreat deeper and seal millstone doors behind them, they don't just create physical barriers. They also trap the invaders in spaces with limited ventilation, especially if the main shafts serving those upper areas can be blocked from within. A small, smoky fire set in the right place, starved of fresh air, can turn those chambers into suffocating traps while the people below continue to breathe. The complexity of this design tells us something about intent. You don't carve multi-level shafts, carefully thread them through inhabited spaces, and engineer ways to close or open them on command if you expect to be underground for a single anxious night each decade. These systems speak to a planning horizon of weeks. Enough time for a siege to drag on, for weather to clear, for an army to move on, or an agreement to be reached. Air, more than stone, sets the upper limit on how long you can hide. The fact that people invested so much effort in mastering its behaviour suggests they imagined more than fleeting refuge. They were designing for repeated, extended stays in the dark, long enough that every breath had to be accounted for, and every shaft of moving air became part of a survival strategy written, not on paper, but into the rock itself. If air is the first invisible problem underground, water is the second, and it's even less forgiving. You can survive a day or two breathing stale, smoky air. You can't survive long at all without something to drink. And unlike air, water can't be borrowed from the next room over. It has to be stored or summoned or intercepted as it moves in the rock. In Cappadocia's underground cities, that meant one thing above all: wells. Some are obvious, broad circular shafts with carved steps or ledges, sunk deep into the tuff, widening slightly at the bottom where they meet a natural reservoir or crack in the bedrock. Others are more ambiguous, slender, bottle-shaped cavities with a narrow neck and a wider chamber below, reachable only by rope or careful footwork. In both cases, the logic is similar. You bring the water as close to the inhabited levels as the geology allows, but you keep the actual source protected. In Derinkuyu, there's at least one well that appears to have been deliberately isolated from the surface. It's fed from below by groundwater, not from a visible opening above. That matters. If an enemy controls the plateau, they can't simply throw poison or carcasses into your well from outside. The connection is hidden in the rock, and the people inside hold the access point. Other shafts are more ambiguous. Some may once have opened to the surface and later been narrowed, capped, or integrated into courtyards. You can imagine why. A city that lives or dies by its water must walk a tightrope between accessibility and secrecy. You want to lower buckets easily. You don't want a stranger with a sack of something unpleasant to find the mouth. This is where the underground planners had to think in two dimensions at once, vertical and hygienic. Bringing water deep into the complex is only half the battle. Keeping it clean in a crowded, confined environment is the other. And here the rock remembers habits just as clearly as it remembers tunnels. Archaeologists notice that wells, cisterns and channels are usually set apart from obvious waste areas. Latrine-like recesses, small pits in corners, and slopes worn with darker deposits tend to appear inside corridors, at dead ends or near entrances and animal stables. Water features are more centrally placed, often in spaces that are cleaner, with fewer soot stains and less debris in the fill. You get a faint outline of zoning. This is where you draw and store water. That is where you dispose of what your body doesn't need. We don't have written sanitation codes from the people who used Derinkuyu, but physiology and common sense give us some constraints. Thousands of people staying underground for days or weeks generate a steady stream of waste. You cannot just let it accumulate where you sleep. The easiest solution is temporal. For short stays, much of the biological problem simply doesn't have time to fully develop. Excrement can be bagged, piled in designated corners, or stored in sealed containers, then carried out and dumped when the danger passes. Odour would be unpleasant, but diseases that depend on long-term contamination of water and soil would be slower to take hold. For longer sieges, things get trickier. In some underground complexes, small drains cut into the floor led toward deeper, unused cavities. These could have been used to channel dirty water. Wash water, not drinking water, away from main galleries. Elsewhere, pits in the lowest accessible levels may have served as soakaways, places where liquid waste could slowly seep into the porous tuff. Neither solution is ideal, but in a crisis, you're not designing a modern wastewater plant. You're trying to keep fecal contamination from reaching the very wells that keep you alive. That separation is probably why the most important wells tend to be surrounded by carved rims or low parapets. A bump stops a bucket from tipping filth back into the mouth. A clear edge discourages animals from walking right up and trampling the area. Around some shafts you find flat working surfaces, places to set jars, tie ropes, or pour water into smaller vessels, keeping the constant splash and slop away from the source itself. Clean water also intersects with food. One of the quiet advantages of living under rock is temperature. Underground rooms in Cappadocia tend to hover around a cool, stable climate, much lower than the summer heat at the surface. For grain, wine, and certain fruits, that's ideal. Underground cellars across the region, not just in the cities, show niches for amphorae, troughs carved into the floor for jars, and shelves cut from the walls. In a world without refrigeration, the earth itself becomes your fridge. The same coolness that slows spoilage, though, creates other risks. Moist, cool spaces are hospitable to molds, to bacteria, to the slow growth of things you don't want in your drinking water or your stored flour. If a leaking jar sits too close to a well, or spoiled food is dumped in an unused niche near a water-rich crack, the contamination can spread invisibly. In a densely occupied refuge, a single bad decision, a carcass thrown down the wrong hole, a child washing dirty hands in the well instead of a basin, can ripple through the entire population a few days later. So you can imagine a set of informal rules emerging, passed on more by habit than by proclamation. Don't wash clothes where you draw drinking water. Keep animal pens downhill from wells, in the literal sense of the tunnel's slopes. Dump kitchen waste in the same designated hollow every time, not just wherever is convenient. Use certain jars for water, others for oil or grain. Don't mix them. Even without germ theory, people notice patterns. They remember when we used that shaft as a dump, more people got sick. When we kept the well clear and fetched from that clean place, they didn't. Over generations, those memories harden into custom, and custom shapes the rock. What's striking when you look at the underground water systems is how planned they feel, yet how layered. Some wells look original to the deepest, oldest parts of the complexes. Others seem to have been deepened, reshaped, or even abandoned and replaced by new shafts cut from higher levels. Cisterns are sometimes plastered, sometimes not, hinting at different construction phases and different understandings of leakage and cleanliness. This mixture of careful placement and later adjustment suggests a long learning curve. Early builders probably started with whatever water the geology offered, combining air and water shafts, taking what they could get. Later users, after a few bad experiences or simple observation, may have started segregating functions. This shaft is for breathing, that one is for drinking. These side galleries are for waste. In other words, the hidden flows beneath Cappadocia's plateaus, of water, of damp air, of liquid waste, tell the same story as the ventilation system, but from another angle. These were not one-time panic shelters hacked out in a single season. They were evolving machines for staying alive, tuned and retuned across centuries, as generation after generation tried to push the same boundary. How long can you keep thousands of people underground before the water, not the enemy, forces you back to the light? If water sets the hard upper limit on survival underground, Food quietly defines everything else. Who can go below, when they go, and how long they dare to stay. You can improvise with air for a while. You can stretch water if you're careful. But food is math. Cold, simple, unforgiving math. The rock keeps a record of how people tried to solve that equation. Walk through the plans and descriptions of Derinkuyu and the other Cappadocian complexes, and you keep running into certain spaces. Broad, undecorated rooms with smooth walls, carved niches, sometimes low platforms along the sides. They're not chapels, they're not stables, they're not living quarters, they're storage. Grain, first of all, in a pre-industrial agrarian society. Grain is the battery that runs everything. Wheat, barley, millet, dried, threshed, winnowed and sealed away, each kernel a tiny package of calories that can last for years if you treat it well. The underground environment helps. Once you get down past the daily temperature swing of the surface, the rock settles into a narrow band, cool in summer, relatively mild in winter. No scorching heat to crack jars or drive off moisture. No hard frost to burst containers. For grain and legumes, lentils, chickpeas, beans, that stability is gold. Dry them thoroughly, keep them off the damp floor, protect them from rats and insects, and they can sit, season after season, waiting. Archaeologists studying Cappadocia's rock-cut architecture point to silo-like pits, bottle-shaped cavities with narrow necks and wider bellies carved into floors or lower walls. Dry goods stored in such spaces are naturally isolated. Cool air sinks, warmer air rises, and the narrow opening limits the exchange. Grain can be poured in from above, then drawn out as needed with minimal disturbance. A skin, a lid, or a stone cap over the top keeps out humidity and pests. The same logic appears in wall niches sized for jars and amphorae. A jar of dried figs, raisins, or nuts. Another of salted cheese or cured meat, oil in a sealed container, maybe wine in a larger vessel at the back. Each item processed to last, boiled, dried, smoked, salted, or submerged in fat or brine. The underground city doesn't generate food. It slows the clock on food gathered and prepared at the surface. That distinction matters because it tells you something about how these places were really used. You can't, in any realistic scenario, grow staples underground in rock-cut chambers. At most, you can sprout grain for fodder or greens in small amounts, using precious water and what little light filters down shafts. The main caloric load has to be grown outside, harvested outside, then carried down in sacks, jars and baskets. So the question isn't, could Derinkuyu feed 20,000 people for months? The question is, how much of a harvest could be tucked away in advance, and how fast would thousands of mouths eat through it? Evidence for communal granaries suggests at least some of the answer lay in shared planning. Some storage rooms are large enough that no single nuclear family would realistically fill them in ordinary times. Their position, central, close to main circulation routes, sometimes near churches or meeting spaces, hints at a collective function. Grain from many households could be pooled here, perhaps as a tithe, an emergency store, or a negotiated reserve under the control of elders or leaders. Elsewhere, smaller niches and side rooms, harder to access, feel more like household caches. A family might keep its own jars of grain, pulses, oil and dried fruit in spaces it controlled directly, supplementing whatever the community could distribute in a crisis. That mixed system, shared reserves plus private stashes, is exactly what you'd expect in a world where trust and scarcity coexist. You help the group survive, but you also hedge against the group's failure. Then there's the problem of turning all that stored food into something you can actually eat. Cooking underground is not as simple as setting up a fire wherever you like. Every flame consumes oxygen and produces smoke, carbon dioxide, and fine particulates. In a closed environment, that's deadly over time. So fire use had to be carefully rationed, limited hearths in well-ventilated areas, with flues or proximity to major shafts. Soot staining on ceilings and walls is a crude map of where that happened. You see more intense blackening in certain kitchens and large communal rooms, quieter, cleaner rock in deep dormitory spaces that probably never saw open flame during crowded periods. Fuel itself is a constraint. Wood, charcoal, dried dung all have to be brought below in advance or in brief, risky dashes during relative safety. Every armful of firewood you carry down is an armful you didn't use to heat your house above or cook at the surface. In that context, people likely shifted their diet when in hiding. Grains and legumes can be parboiled or fully cooked ahead of time, then dried for later quick preparation. Bulgur, for example, parboiled, dried, cracked wheat, is an efficient way of turning hard grain into something that can be rehydrated with minimal fuel. Porridges and soups make sense. One pot, many mouths, heat conserved as long as possible. Flatbreads cooked quickly on hot stones or metal surfaces are more efficient than long-baked loaves. You can imagine a quiet choreography. Food that needs the most fuel prepared at the surface when threats are distant. Food that needs only a little heat or none at all saved for deep time underground. Soaked beans, cold grain mush, dried fruit, nuts. The underground isn't where you show off culinary skill. It's where you stretch calories under a strict budget of air and fire. All of this feeds back into siege timelines. Take a notional population, say several thousand people crowded into Derinkuyu and its neighbouring complexes. Even with excellent harvests and careful storage, every day underground eats through sacks of grain, jars of legumes, and whatever animal products they've salted or dried. Food is bulky. The rock can hold a lot, but there are limits. Volume of rooms, labour to carve them, weight you can physically haul down the narrow stairways in peacetime. And people don't want to live with every chamber packed to the ceiling with sacks, blocking movement and making fire and lamp use even riskier. The underground city has to function as a refuge, not a static warehouse. That pushes most historians and archaeologists toward a similar conclusion. These places were built to sustain large populations for days to a few weeks at a time, perhaps longer in lean, highly disciplined conditions, but not for open-ended months-long isolation of tens of thousands. The logistics are simply too tight. You can rotate animals and people in and out, send foraging parties during lulls, ration carefully, and lean hard on grain and legumes that store well. You can design clever cellars that turn the earth into a refrigerator. But every extra day below ground makes the next one harder. The granaries shrink, the fuel piles diminish, the air blackens around the hearths. At some point, the number on the invisible chalkboard doesn't balance anymore, and the rock itself starts to say what the enemy on the surface hasn't yet said aloud. It's time to go back up. Grain and jars and amphorae tell you a lot about calories. But if you want to understand how these places really worked in a crisis, you have to listen for hooves and bleating in the dark. Because beneath the sleeping chambers and storerooms of Cappadocia's underground cities, archaeologists keep finding something else. Long, low spaces with tethering holes carved into the walls, shallow troughs, sometimes a slight slope in the floor for drainage. Stables. It's an odd thought at first. Why drag animals down those tight, twisting corridors, one nervous step at a time, when space and air are already at a premium? But once you step back into the mindset of a small farming community, it starts to make brutal economic sense. Not every animal is worth that effort. Chickens, for instance, are noisy, messy, and fragile. They don't travel well through narrow tunnels. and a few days of disruption on the surface won't wipe them out as long as some survive in scattered coops around the countryside. Pigs are similar, valuable meat, but hard to move en masse, and they compete directly with humans for grain. The animals most likely brought underground were the ones that concentrated value: sheep and goats for milk, wool and meat, cattle in smaller numbers, and above all working animals, donkeys, mules, sometimes horses. A family's plough team or pack animals were not just beasts, they were the engine of next year's harvest, the truck fleet, the tractor, the savings account. Lose grain, and you starve this winter. Lose your animals and you may starve for the next 5 years. So when raiders appear on the horizon, or word spreads that conscription parties are moving through nearby towns, the most precious animals go down into the rock. The design of the stables reflects a compromise between compassion, necessity, and geology. You don't put animals at the very bottom, that would be a nightmare for air quality and manure removal. In complexes like Derinkuyu, the stables tend to cluster nearer the upper levels, but still behind defensible choke points. They're close enough to major ventilation shafts that air can move, but far enough from crowded sleeping areas that the worst of the smell can be kept at bay. Even so, there is no way to make underground stabling pleasant. Large animals produce heat, moisture, methane and ammonia. Every pile of dung adds to the biological load in the air. Every breath they take competes with human lungs for oxygen. Waste has to go somewhere. In some complexes, slopes and gutters suggest deliberate efforts to channel urine and wash water toward drains or deeper pits. Manure could be piled in designated corners, maybe even partially composted, but in a prolonged stay it would have been an ever-growing problem. Ventilation shafts that are comfortable with a few hundred humans and their lamps start to struggle when you add dozens of animals. Warm, humid organic air rises more slowly. Stagnant pockets form. The smell of ammonia can sting the eyes and irritate lungs long before it reaches life-threatening levels. In a space with limited airflow, the threshold is even lower. Noise is another limit you can't ignore. A frightened donkey brays, a restless cow lowing in the night, the clatter of hooves on rock, the shuffle and cough of penned animals. Sound carries far in stone tunnels. In an ideal refuge, the enemy on the surface hears nothing. In reality, a city full of people and livestock can only mute, not erase, its presence. Then there's fodder. Every mouth that chews hay or grain is taking food that might otherwise go to people. You can graze animals on the surface during lull periods. You can bring down bundles of straw and chaff. You can feed them the byproducts of human processing. But in a tight siege, keeping even a modest stable fed quickly becomes a major draw on the same storage rooms that sustain the population. That paradox is at the heart of survival economics underground. You need animals to recover after a raid, a community that emerges with its plough oxen, its seed grain, and its breeding flock intact can bounce back from burned fields and stolen stores. A community that loses those things may be alive, but economically crippled. The underground city is, in this sense, a vault for future productivity, not just present calories. At the same time, the more animals you protect, the more you shorten the safe time below. Their breathing, their heat, their fodder, needs all push the invisible clock on the wall forward. Ancient people understood this intuitively, even if they never wrote it down in ledgers. You can see it in how stables are sized and placed. They are big enough to hold a meaningful number of animals, but not so vast that they resemble the great surface barns of a wealthy estate. They are tucked into side corridors and lower halls, not sprawled across prime central real estate. This is not the infrastructure of a permanent, fully livestocked underground metropolis. It is the infrastructure of a refuge that expects to be crowded, smelly and strained for relatively short bursts. If Derinkuyu and its siblings were meant as continuous, year-round cities, stable design would look very different. You'd expect more elaborate waste channels, segregated air shafts dedicated to livestock, even underground fodder cultivation schemes. Instead, what we see are pragmatic solutions built into a world where life, for most of the year, happens on the surface. Fields, open courtyards, ordinary barns. When danger comes, the model flips. People descend, along with a carefully chosen subset of animals, the irreplaceable ones, the ones whose loss would be felt for years. The result is a layered refuge, humans clustered in the deeper, quieter levels, animals in the upper, more ventilated, more expendable zones. A few weeks of discomfort, a powerful stench that lingers in the rock, and then when the threat ebbs, everything moves back up. The stables, more than almost any other feature, strip away the fantasy of a hidden, self-contained underground civilization. What they show instead is something more grounded and in its own way more impressive. Communities planning not only to survive the attack, but to stand back up afterward, to plough, to trade, to rebuild. The rock shelters bodies for a season. The animals, sweating and restless in their carved pens, shelter the future. If the stables show you what they were trying to save, the doors show you what they were afraid of. Because every major underground city in Cappadocia shares one unnerving feature. At key junctions, the smooth, pale tuff of the walls suddenly gives way to a round, looming disc. A shallow groove in the floor, a slot in the wall. Stone waiting to roll. These are the famous rolling stone doors, often compared to millstones because of their shape. They were carved right out of the same volcanic rock as everything else, but left attached until they were almost finished, then cut free so they could pivot or roll into place. They're not dainty. Some are a metre thick, a couple of metres across, weighing hundreds of kilos, too heavy for one person to casually shove aside, but balanced just carefully enough that with the right leverage, 2 or 3 people could wrestle them along their track. Look closely at how they work, and the logic becomes clear. The doors don't sit in obvious ceremonial frames. They're tucked into side recesses, offset slightly from the main passage. In peacetime they can be left open, resting in their niches, the corridor looking almost ordinary. But when a warning comes, a signal from the surface, a shout from an upper gallery, someone at the choke point can heave the disc forward, slotting it across the tunnel. Once in place, it's like a cork in a bottle. The edge of the stone fits into a carved channel in the floor and ceiling, a tongue and groove system that makes it very hard to pry loose from the enemy's side. Often there's a small hole left in the centre of the disc, just large enough for a spear, or for a hand to pass food or a message. From the defender's side you can jab, listen, even negotiate. From the attacker's side you are face to face with a wall. A clever enemy might think to burn the door out, but there's nothing to burn. It's carved rock. They might try to smoke defenders out, but smoke in a confined surface tunnel hurts the attackers too. They could batter at it with logs or metal tools, but that takes time and noise, exactly what a hidden community, fully alerted and locked down, can use to their advantage on deeper levels. The rolling doors don't stand alone. They're part of a broader pattern, narrow corridors, sudden turns, low ceilings that force tall men to hunch and break formation. Picture the geometry. You enter from the surface through a sloping passage that quickly bends and tightens. The floor may step down or up abruptly. On the way in, you're disoriented, ducking, adjusting your footing, your eyes still trying to adapt to lamplight. Just ahead, the tunnel constricts to the width of one person at a time. From a defensive standpoint, this is perfect. A group of raiders can't fan out. They can't charge shoulder to shoulder. They file in one by one, the strength of numbers turned into a long, fragile line. Any weapon longer than a spear becomes awkward. Shields must be held sideways or left behind. Now imagine that. Just beyond this pinch point, a rolling stone door waits in its notch. The defenders know every bump and step of this terrain. They can time their moves, let a few enemies pass the choke, let the rest crowd up behind in the narrow approach, then slam the door shut between them. Suddenly the attackers are split, a handful trapped inside with no easy retreat, the rest cut off, stuck in the entrance tunnel, unable to see what's happening beyond the curve. This is layered security in 3 dimensions, one door rarely guarded, just one passage. Often it protects a junction. Beyond it, stairs drop away to deeper levels, side tunnels branch off towards storage rooms or sleeping areas. Shut the stone, and you don't just close a hallway, you seal off an entire zone of the city. Further below, there might be another choke point, another disc. Even if an attacker somehow forced one door, they'd find themselves in a maze of tight corridors and blind corners. Each one another potential kill zone, each one another opportunity for defenders to pull back and seal yet another barrier. Taken together, the architecture feels less like a home and more like a series of fallback positions. This is where communication between levels matters. An underground city is not a single flat plane, it's stacked. If you're trying to keep hundreds or thousands of people coordinated through rock, shouting alone won't do. Sound travels strangely in tunnels, too far in some directions, not far enough in others. A scream in a dead end can echo. A warning from the surface might never reach the 3rd or 4th level unless the system expects it. So archaeologists and speleologists have looked for patterns. In some complexes, vertical shafts and narrow spiral passages connect levels at strategic points, not only for air or movement, but likely for messages. A boy or girl sure-footed and familiar with the routes can sprint from a surface entrance down 3 levels in minutes, ducking through low-side corridors, passing news from one guard post to the next. You can imagine a hierarchy of alerts. A watch on the surface signals first, perhaps by a pre-arranged knock, a whistle, or simply by rushing in. The uppermost residents begin to withdraw. Animals are hurried further in. The first line of doors rolled into place. Runners peel off, one racing down to the main communal spaces to spread the word, another to a deeper guard station, where men and women can arm themselves and take assigned positions. Because this is the other implication of the architecture, planned retreat. You don't put massive, carefully balanced doors at random points if your only goal is to hide. You put them where they will let you slow, channel, and if necessary abandon space in a controlled way. Upper levels can be sacrificed, storage rooms, stables, maybe even some living quarters, if it buys time for the majority to hunker down in the depths behind the last, heaviest barriers. This pattern tells us something about the nature of the threat. Rock doesn't care if it's windy. You don't roll a 1-ton door across your own hallway to block a storm. You can't seal yourself off from drought with a disk of stone. Volcanoes, earthquakes, plagues, none of these are deterred by a choke point. But other humans are. The doors and narrow passages make sense against raiders, soldiers, tax collectors who come with force. They're designed to neutralize cavalry, to break up advancing groups, to turn an invading column into a vulnerable trickle. They assume an enemy that wants to come in, take things, capture people, maybe occupy the surface settlement. The Rock City's job is to make that as costly and slow as possible. So costly that the attackers give up before they ever get to the majority of the population. And yet, every defensive measure is also a form of self-denial. A narrow tunnel is great for defence, but miserable for daily traffic. You can't easily haul large objects through it. Passing someone going the other way means one of you has to back up. Low ceilings save stone and help control an enemy's movement, but they also demand that you stoop every time you go to fetch water or take grain to storage. Rolling doors are worse. They occupy space even when they're open. The grooves in the floor create trip hazards. The stones themselves block light and air when closed, dividing the city into sealed compartments that in a prolonged siege could become pockets of stale, strained atmosphere. Designing these spaces, the builders were always trading comfort for security. A purely livable underground complex meant to be a permanent, pleasant city would favour wider corridors, smoother gradients, more open junctions. What we see instead are repeated sacrifices to the logic of control, bottlenecks, zigzags, barriers that require effort to bypass even on a quiet day. And yet people chose to carve and use them. That suggests a mental world in which danger from other humans was not an occasional shock, but a background condition of life. You farm, you trade, you marry, you worship, all under the silent assumption that at some point you and your children may have to funnel through those choke points in the half-dark, listening for the rumble of stone behind you as the doors of safety roll shut. The city is not just a shelter, it is a controlled machine of movement of who gets in, who gets through, and who gets left on which side of the rock when the enemy finally comes. And once you start to see the underground in those terms, the layout itself begins to look less like a warren and more like a map of power and order, a topic that only becomes clearer when you try to imagine how anyone found their way around in the dark. Finding your way is not a side issue in a place like this. It's survival. On a bright Anatolian morning, the surface village is simple to read. Sunlight marks the courtyards, tracks the streets, throws long shadows from the dovecotes and chimneys. You can point to the well, the threshing floor, the neighbour's house with the loud chickens. Underground, all of that vanishes the moment you turn two corners. The rock does not care about your sense of direction. Every tunnel looks like every other tunnel, same soft walls, same dusty floor, same ceiling that brushes your hair if you're tall. There is no sky to orient you, no distant mountain to keep on your left. Step away from the shaft of light at the entrance and, almost immediately, you are in a world where north and south stop meaning very much. So how do you not get lost? Archaeology can't hand us a user's manual for Derinkuyu, but we can listen to what other cave-dwelling cultures, miners and labyrinth builders have learned, and then look again at the layout. One clue is that the maze is not random. The deeper you go, the more the chaos resolves into patterns. On many plans, you can see clusters of rooms grouped around a main corridor or staircase, like grapes hanging from a stem. These bunches probably weren't just architectural conveniences, they were social units. A family cluster here, an extended kin group there, perhaps a couple of households that shared herds or trade. If you grow up in one of those clusters, the route home is not a puzzle. Your body learns it. Turn left at the cool draft, duck under the low beam, count 6 steps, your hand brushing that one rough patch in the wall, then right at the place where the floor slopes a little more. You don't need a map, your muscles are the map. Children raised here would know the path to their sleeping alcove as intimately as a modern child knows the way from bed to kitchen in the dark. Beyond the family zones, the city seems to divide by function. You have stable districts with their tether holes and feeding troughs, storage districts, rows of carved bins and niches for amphorae, communal areas, broad chambers with benches cut into the walls, or flat floors large enough for a small crowd. In some sites, you can trace a kind of vertical zoning too. Animals and heavy work on certain levels, living and ritual spaces elsewhere. That functional geography becomes a mental compass. Down 2 levels toward the animal smell, then across to the cool grain rooms, up toward the chapel. Directions are no longer about cardinal points, but about moving through a hierarchy of uses. Your sense of place is tied to what happens there, where you sleep, where you pound grain, where you pray, where you listen for news. Light, or the lack of it, shapes that experience. These cities were not flooded with brightness. At best, you had small oil lamps, simple stone or ceramic cups with a wick drinking animal fat or olive oil. They produce a fluttering local glow, just enough to keep you from smashing your forehead on the ceiling. They also produce soot. Over time, ceilings blacken, air grows heavy in dead-end rooms if you burn too many. So you ration light. Main corridors and key junctions get lamps. Family rooms might get a single flame. Deep storage spaces are probably visited with a lamp borrowed in the hand, then left dark again. Your eyes live in a permanent low-light state, never fully day or fully night. Emotionally, that has consequences. Dimness narrows the world to a small circle around you. Faces loom out of shadow. The end of a corridor is always a suggestion rather than a certainty. For someone unfamiliar, an outsider, a raider, that half-seen, endlessly branching space is fertile ground for anxiety. Every turn might hide an ambush. Every shadow might be a trap. For an insider, routine fights the fear. You go to the same cistern at the same hour. You know which step near the junction is slightly chipped, which corner your cousin likes to lean against. The very repetition of these small details builds a quiet confidence. Here is where the slope steepens. Here is where the ceiling dips. Nothing unexpected. But that calm doesn't appear on its own. It has to be organised. If these places were used as refuges in times of danger, you can assume there were rules for movement, especially during a rapid descent. Modern emergency planners talk about egress flow and panic prevention. Our ancestors didn't use those words, but they lived the problem. You cannot have 500 people charging down a narrow-hewn stair in random order without accidents. Someone trips, someone drops a bundle, someone turns back, and in minutes the passage clogs. So you can imagine routines drilled into people's heads long before the alarm ever came. Certain families assigned to certain entrances. A known order, animals first or last, depending on strategy. Elders and infants at a certain point in the line, a designated person at each choke point to keep people moving and decide when to roll a door. Perhaps even specific phrases: keep to the right, hands on the wall, no lamps in this corridor, repeated so often they become reflex. Silence might be a rule too. Loud, panicked shouting carries unpredictably underground and could betray the scale of your population to ears on the surface. Quiet, focused movement, small signals, a hand on a shoulder. These are better suited to funneling human beings through rock. In this context, confusion becomes a tool to the inhabitants. The city is a series of practiced routes and understood districts. To an intruder, especially one who has just forced an entry and stepped beyond a breached door, it is deliberate disorientation. Passages double back. Some staircases lead to dead ends, or did they? Perhaps they once connected to other levels now sealed, leaving ghost corridors that go nowhere. Side rooms open unexpectedly, any of which might hide defenders. A lamp sputters in a niche, casting unstable shadows that stretch and compress the space. With their knowledge of the plan, locals can vanish one way and reappear from another, like water flowing through channels invisible to an outsider. A raiding party, deprived of clear landmarks and harassed from multiple directions, might feel that the underground is not just a city but a living thing actively resisting their presence. This is the deeper logic of the maze. It is not only a byproduct of carving in irregular rock or of centuries of expansion. It is a quiet agreement between stone and society, the same twists and choke points that slow a stranger can be read, like a book by those who belong here. And that reading of space, who is allowed to know which paths, who sleeps near which junction, who stands where when the alarm is raised, begins to look a lot like social order turned into architecture, a pattern that becomes even clearer when we step into the rooms where people spent their days and nights, living ordinary lives in an extraordinary place. If the corridors are the city's arteries, the bedrooms are its capillaries, small, intimate spaces where the larger system resolves into individual lives. Sleep, for most people here, is not a private act the way it is in many modern societies. It's a group activity. When you look at the carved rooms in Derinkuyu and other Cappadocian sites, they tend to be just big enough for a few sleeping bodies at a time, sometimes with low ledges or niches cut along the walls. You can imagine these not as single-occupant bedrooms, but as family alcoves. Parents and young children sleeping tangled together on mats, perhaps older children or unmarried siblings in an adjacent chamber off the same corridor. Privacy in this world is not about walls and doors, it's about layers of access. The doorway to your family's cluster might be one step more hidden, one turn more obscure. The most vulnerable people, infants, elders, the sick, are probably placed deeper in, further from the main routes where strangers or even neighbours might pass. Your room is defined as much by who is allowed to come there as by what is carved in the rock. Within the same cluster, finer gradations of privacy could be negotiated socially. A corner where a couple is understood to sleep, a particular niche where someone keeps precious objects. Curtains of woven cloth or animal hide might divide the space, not soundproofing anything but signalling boundaries. You don't step past this hanging without a reason. In the quiet hours, those thin partitions would carry sound. Coughs, whispered arguments, a child's breathing, someone turning restlessly on a straw mat. Noise doesn't disappear underground, it travels. But the rock also absorbs and blurs it, turning sharp sounds into a murmur. With time, that constant background of human presence could become oddly comforting. If you step just beyond the sleeping zones, the texture of daily life changes. The rock starts to tell different stories. Across Cappadocia's underground cities, archaeologists have found rooms with low benches running along the walls, shallow basins carved into the floor, circular depressions that once held grinding stones. These are interpreted as workspaces, places where grain was milled, dough was prepared, maybe where cheese was drained and pressed. You can imagine a rhythm to these rooms. At one end, women and older children turning quern stones back and forth, hour after hour, to produce flour for a population that might be living underground for weeks at a time. Near them, someone kneading dough, another shaping flatbreads to be carried to ovens, perhaps on the surface in safer seasons, perhaps in carefully ventilated underground baking chambers when hiding. Elsewhere, narrow niches and small, regular holes cut into walls suggest looms and storage for spindles. We don't have a sign that says weaving room, but when you combine these features with what we know from traditional Anatolian villages, a picture emerges, quiet crafts taking over the long hours of confinement. Weaving, spinning, mending clothes, braiding rope, knotting nets, these are jobs that can be done in dim light, seated, with tools that are easy to carry below. They also help pass the time. A siege that lasts 10 days is 10 days of boredom unless you turn it into production. Then there are the rooms with broad, flat floors, a little more open, sometimes with shallow pits, thought to be for pressing grapes or olives, when the underground system served more as a seasonal economic centre than an emergency shelter. In those same spaces during a crisis, you can picture tool repair taking over. Metal is precious, difficult to smelt, easy to damage. Any prolonged stay in the earth would require someone, a village smith or a handy elder, sitting cross-legged with hammer and anvil stone, tightening clasps, straightening bent knives, sharpening farming blades, that might double as weapons if the situation on the surface worsened. Sound in these workrooms would be a layered thing. The dull thud of grain stones, the soft rasp of fibre sliding through fingers, the occasional ring of metal on stone. Nearby, a baby fusses, soothed by a sibling who has been given the job of walking slow laps up and down the corridor. Voices stay low, laughter bubbles up and is quickly damped. Smell is even harder to escape. You have oil lamps burning animal fat or precious olive oil. Animals stabled on certain levels, their warmth useful but their manure inevitable. People tightly packed, sharing air. Food cooking, if fires are allowed, produces smoke and steam that must find their way up the ventilation shafts without choking everyone in between. Archaeologists point to soot-blackened ceilings and ventilation chimneys as evidence that the inhabitants thought hard about this problem. They couldn't eliminate smell, but they could manage it, putting stables closer to specific shafts, letting certain sectors bear the brunt of animal odour, while residential clusters were kept as fresh as circumstances allowed. In such an environment, daily life becomes a choreography of bodies, ages, and moods. Children can't be allowed to sprint wildly through choke points or scream in echoing chambers, yet they still need to move, to play, to learn. One can imagine informal routines, a stretch of corridor designated for games when danger is low, an elder settled at a junction telling stories, drawing little ones close with tales of saints or heroes or older times, when the underground city was first carved. Those elders are more than extra mouths. In a cold, controlled, and sometimes frightening environment, they are repositories of memory and morale. They know which room floods slightly in spring, which wall weeps when the snow melts, which tunnel should not be used if the enemy is likely to dig. Their knowledge doesn't appear in the rock, but it shapes how the space is used. Maintaining spirits underground is its own form of engineering. Light is rationed not only for fuel, but for mood. Lamps brightened in communal areas at certain times, dimmed in sleeping zones. Tasks are distributed to keep hands and minds busy. If there is singing, it might be soft, rhythmic, tied to work, grain-grinding songs, spinning songs, rather than exuberant choruses that could carry up a shaft. All of this, though, we glimpse through a keyhole. The rock shows us floor plans, niches, troughs, benches, soot stains. It does not show us arguments about sharing blankets, or the quiet comfort of someone braiding a child's hair by lamplight. When archaeologists label a room kitchen or bedroom, they are making educated guesses, comparing these spaces to known village houses, monasteries, and troglodyte dwellings from later periods. Derinkuyu and its neighbours were not frozen dioramas of a single moment. They were modified, reused, reinterpreted over centuries. A chamber that once echoed with loom weights might, in a later era, hold sleeping refugees. A former wine press might be repurposed as a meeting hall or a schoolroom for teaching prayers away from hostile eyes. So, when we talk about community life down here, we're building a composite from many layers: architectural clues, ethnographic parallels, the stubborn logic of human needs. People need to sleep and eat, to work and rest, to keep children safe and elders respected, to hold their nerves together when stone closes in and the surface feels dangerous. These underground cities are, among other things, stone records of how far a community will go to meet those needs when the ordinary village above cannot be trusted, and how those same communities bound their days not only with work and sleep, but with meaning, something that becomes even clearer when we step into their underground chapels and carved crosses, and watch faith follow them into the dark. If you keep walking past the workrooms and animal stalls, there comes a point in many of these underground cities where the rock suddenly feels different, not in material but in intention. The walls are smoothed more carefully. The space opens a little. Niches appear at regular heights, as if waiting for something precious to be set inside. Sometimes there's a low apse, a shallow half-dome carved into the end wall. In a few places there's even a crude T-shaped relief, a cross. These are the spaces most archaeologists agree on. Whatever else is debated, most scholars see these chambers as chapels or oratories carved by Christian communities during the late Antique and Byzantine periods. We recognise their language because we've seen it elsewhere, in rock-cut churches above ground in Cappadocia, in monastic cells, in village shrines, a cross carved on the eastern wall, a basin that looks suspiciously like a font, benches or low platforms where a small group could kneel or sit. The presence of these features tells us something important about who, at least in some periods, was using these underground complexes. These are not the secret temples of a forgotten cult. They are the ordinary, practical, yet deeply meaningful worship spaces of Christians living in frontier territory, villagers, monks, perhaps small monastic communities who already saw the rock as a friend. But the story doesn't start and end there. The rock in Cappadocia is a palimpsest. Every new cut can slice through older rooms. Every new symbol can overwrite earlier meanings. When you see a clearly Christian chapel deep in a complex like Derinkuyu, you're probably looking at a late chapter in a much longer book. Earlier use is more elusive. Some archaeologists have suggested that certain chapel-like spaces might originally have been something else. Assembly halls, storage rooms, even animal pens, only later reoriented toward worship, when Christian communities took over or recarved the system. Others wonder whether some plain, undecorated chambers might have hosted pre-Christian rituals, ancestor veneration, local cult practices, oath-taking. We don't have altars dedicated to Zeus or inscriptions naming local gods. What we have are shapes, a raised platform here, a carefully flattened floor there, arrangements that feel deliberate. It's possible that in earlier centuries those rooms formed the sacred heart of a community long before anyone carved a cross. But our evidence for that is thin, and historians tend to be cautious. Rock alone rarely tells you which god someone had in mind. What is clearer is the psychological function these spaces served once Christian communities were firmly established in the region. Imagine you've been driven underground by raids, taxes collected by force, or a passing army that doesn't particularly care whether your village survives its march. For days, maybe weeks, your world has narrowed to tunnels, low ceilings, the ceaseless routines of grinding grain, tending animals, trying to keep children quiet. In that compressed existence, a small carved chapel becomes more than just another room. It's the place where time briefly changes shape. Work stops, or at least slows. People gather not because of immediate necessity, food, water, defense, but because of something more abstract. The need to believe that what is happening has a frame, a story, a meaning. Ritual in that context is a technology of the mind. Saying the same prayers at the same time each day, crossing yourself as you pass a particular niche, lighting a lamp before a carved cross, and letting the flame stand in for words you're too tired to say. These repeated actions do for the psyche what the massive stone doors do for the corridors. They create a sense of containment, of order, of control. Even the layout of some chapels reflects this. A narrow entrance, then a slightly wider interior, like a breath after a constriction. A focal point on one wall, an apse, a cross, a painted surface in later periods that anchors attention. Benches along the sides encouraging people to sit facing the same direction, sharing a vantage point. In deep time, that kind of shared focus is how communities stabilize themselves. Everyone looks at the same symbol and, for a moment, remembers that they belong to something larger than their immediate fear. For archaeologists, those same symbols are also clocks. Christian iconography develops in recognizable stages. The simplest carvings, Plain crosses, often Latin or Greek in form, might point to late antique or early Byzantine use. More elaborate motifs like cross-in-circle designs, stylized vine scrolls, or carved frames around an apse tend to appear later, when church decoration above ground had also become more ornate. In some Cappadocian sites, you can see layers, an older rough-hewn chamber with a very simple cross, and, superimposed on it, traces of later painting, saints' faces, halos, decorative borders, dating to the Middle Byzantine period. That tells you the room was not just built once and forgotten. It was returned to, refreshed, reinterpreted, as the community's needs and artistic language changed. Reuse complicates our attempts to date the whole city. A single cross does not prove the room itself was carved in a Christian era. It only proves that, by that time, someone considered it a place worth sanctifying. An older storage hall might become a chapel. A once sacred space might later be stripped of its religious furnishings and turned into a dormitory during a particularly crowded crisis. Sacred and practical uses weave together. You can stand in one of these underground chapels, mentally at least, and know that a few meters away there's a stable. Above, a ventilation shaft that doubles as a potential point of danger. Down the corridor, a kitchen, its ceiling blackened. The sacred is not set apart in a quiet, landscaped district. It's embedded in the same network of necessity as everything else. That proximity tells us something about how these communities understood holiness. They weren't building cathedrals that dominated skylines. They were carving chapels that fit between grain silos and defensive choke points. For them, spiritual shelter was not a separate sphere, but another layer of protection, folded into the same stone that kept arrows and swords at bay. You sleep, you work, you worry, you wait, and at some appointed hour you step into a slightly smoother room, stand before a carved cross, and repeat words you know by heart. When you leave, the enemies above are still there, the air is still thin, the food still finite. But psychologically something has shifted. You are not just hiding. You are enduring under someone's eye, whether that someone is a Christian god, earlier deities, or simply the remembered presence of ancestors depends on the time period you're imagining. The rock itself is agnostic. It holds layers of faith like it holds layers of soot. What we can say is that wherever people carve out long-term refuge, they tend to carve out meaning beside it. In Cappadocia's underground cities, chapels and symbols are the most visible trace of that impulse. A reminder that, for the communities who came here, survival was never only about air and water and food. It was also about keeping a story alive that said, "We belong, we are watched over, we will emerge again." And just as tunnels link these sacred rooms to kitchens and stables, other tunnels reach outward, connecting one underground complex to another, turning isolated pockets of faith and fear into a wider, hidden network. Those outward-reaching tunnels are where the story widens. It's tempting to imagine Cappadocia's underground cities as single monolithic entities, Derinkuyu over here, Keimakli over there, each a self-contained world with clear borders and a fixed population. That's how guidebooks and museum signs often present them, labelled dots on a map, like medieval towns with underground walls. The reality was probably messier, and in some ways more impressive. Archaeologists have documented hundreds of subterranean complexes scattered across the region, from tiny clusters of rooms under a single courtyard to sprawling, multi-level systems with their own wells and stables. Some lie just a few kilometres apart, others are separated by entire valleys. When people talk about them as a network, they sometimes mean that literally. There are repeated local claims and a handful of documented cases of long tunnels running between major sites. In a few spots, traces of such passages have been found, though they're often collapsed, blocked, or too unstable to explore. Old villagers will tell you stories of their grandparents walking underground for hours from one town to another, though time is elastic in memory. From a modern armchair, it's easy to project a perfectly connected spiderweb-like system of secret highways beneath Cappadocia. A hidden metro linking every village. The evidence doesn't quite support that. So far, what we can actually point to are confirmed short or medium distance connections, secondary tunnels linking a primary complex to nearby storage areas, to a smaller refuge under a neighbouring courtyard, or to a related cluster under the same settlement. Some deeper shafts may indeed have once reached toward other big centres, but continuous safe passage from one major city to another remains more legend than firmly documented fact. Yet network doesn't have to mean a literal tunnel you can crawl through. Just as those Ice Age populations formed a meta-population, a scattered web of small groups that rose and fell while the larger pattern persisted, Cappadocia's underground world seems to have worked as a loose system of nodes and pathways. Not every node had to touch every other one. It was enough that no single strike from above could remove all options at once. On the surface, people still lived in ordinary villages. Stone houses, courtyards, vineyards, fields, children playing in the alleys, smoke from ovens drifting up at dusk. The underground spaces were not permanent underworld apartments for everyone all the time. They were paired to those surface settlements the way a storm cellar is paired to a farmhouse or a bomb shelter to a neighbourhood. Your life for most of the year was up there. Your insurance policy was down below. That pairing shaped strategy. When danger loomed, raiders on the horizon, tax collectors with a reputation for brutality. A rumour that some governor's army was marching this way. The shift from surface to underground was not a solitary family decision. It was coordinated. Someone had to give the alarm. Someone had to make the call about which entrances to use, which to seal. Here, the network lived as much in human bodies and habits as in stone. Lookouts would have mattered more than kilometre-long tunnels. A boy posted on a ridge path, a shepherd whose grazing routes gave him a clear view of the valley, a monk in a rock-cut cell high on a cliff face, hearing distant hoofbeats before anyone in the village below. Signals could be simple: smoke in a particular pattern, a horn blast repeated down the valley, a runner dispatched along a familiar path. You don't need fibre optic speed when the difference between life and death is measured in hours or half days, not seconds. Messengers connected what the rock did not. A young man could run from one village to the next, faster than you could ever dig a safe tunnel between them. A woman walking with a water jar could quietly pass word that such and such group was seen crossing the plateau. News moved along tracks of kinship and trade, cousins married into the next valley, partners in oxen, shared irrigation channels. In that sense, the interconnections between underground sites were often above ground: marriages, alliances, obligations. You might flee to your own village's refuge today and send your unmarried daughter to shelter with her in-laws in the next village tomorrow, knowing that if your own complex were compromised, theirs might still hold. This is where decentralization shows its quiet strength. If every man, woman and child in the region had relied on a single grand underground city, the system would have been brittle. One siege, one betrayal, one well poisoned, and the entire strategy collapses. Instead, Cappadocia is dotted with dozens, perhaps hundreds, of refuges of varying size and sophistication. Some are probably no more than enlarged cellars with a couple of defensive doors. Others, like Derinkuyu and Kmakli, are full-blown subterranean towns. Together they form something like those scattered Ice Age bands, a meta-population not of genes this time, but of hiding places. A raid might devastate one village, discover its main entrances, perhaps even smoke people out once or twice. But a few kilometres away, another community's complex remained intact, its layout unknown to outsiders. People could disperse, regroup, and with time reoccupy or even recut damaged refuges. From the raiders' perspective, this was infuriating. You could burn houses, trample fields, drive off animals. But the people themselves, the living core of the community, were always more slippery than the stone. They divided, vanished, reappeared. You might occupy a town, but the tunnels beneath it twisted into uncertainty. And even if you managed to map one system, your knowledge didn't necessarily help in the next valley over. For the locals, that persistent uncertainty was a form of defence. They didn't need an underground superhighway. They needed many small, semi-redundant shelters, each tightly known to its own community, loosely linked by paths of kin, trade, gossip, and shared faith. In such a world, a carved cross in one hidden chapel is not just a symbol of belief. It's also a quiet indicator that this refuge, too, belongs to the wider web, that somewhere beyond the next ridge, in another valley with its own tunnels, another group is praying in front of another rock-cut apse, listening for the same distant hoofbeats and watching the same shifting frontiers. Those frontiers would define Cappadocia's history for centuries, first under older Anatolian kingdoms, then under empires whose names still dominate our maps. To understand who started this underground habit and how long it had been in place by the time Christians were carving crosses on the walls, we have to step back to those earlier powers and the dating puzzles they left us in the rock. If you ask a guide in Cappadocia who built the underground cities, you'll usually get a confident answer. The Hittites, some will say, pointing back more than 3,000 years to the late Bronze Age empire that carved lions and storm gods into the rock, and fought pharaohs to a standstill. Others will tell you it was the Phrygians, the people of King Midas' fame, who rose in the power vacuum after the Hittites collapsed. A third camp likes the Persians, whose Achaemenid empire stretched from the Aegean to India, and who governed central Anatolia through satraps and military roads for 2 centuries. 3 names, 3 very different worlds, 1 underground landscape. It would be satisfying if we could simply match one to the other. Hittites equal tunnels, Phrygians equal stables, Persians equal expansion. A nice, clean origin story. The rock doesn't cooperate. When archaeologists talk about dating a place like Derinkuyu, they're not usually talking about the age of the cavities themselves. They're dating what people left inside them, or what they cut into them later. Ceramics are one of the most reliable clocks. Pottery styles change over time, the shape of a rim, the way a handle is attached, the composition of the clay. If you find a storage jar broken in a corner, and that jar matches forms we know from, say, the 5th century BCE, then at least by that time, someone was using that room. Inscriptions help too when you're lucky enough to have them. A carved cross with a Greek prayer, a short note in an early Anatolian script, even stray letters scratched by a bored child. Writing carries styles and alphabets that rise and fall with empires. A Greek inscription with certain letter forms might point to the Roman period. An Armenian or Syriac graffito suggests a later Christian phase. Tool marks can also whisper dates, though more cautiously. The way a chisel was used, the angle of blows, the pattern of quarrying can match broader technological periods. Iron tools leave different signatures than softer bronze tools. Parallel, regular striations in some rooms might mean a later wave of expansion by people using standardized pickaxes, while more irregular gouging elsewhere might preserve an older phase. Then there are ruse layers. Imagine a room that starts as a simple cellar. A few generations later, someone expands it, cuts a bench, and turns it into a small chapel. Centuries after that, another community blocks off one entrance, widens another, and uses it as a communal kitchen. Each episode can leave traces, sooty ceilings, plastered walls, different floor levels, different kinds of trash. When you excavate, you're reading those layers in reverse order. The most recent phase is on top. The deeper you go, the older it tends to be, at least in theory, until tunnels collapse and people dig new ones into the debris of the old. In Cappadocia, almost all of these dating methods point to repeated use over a very long time, with particularly intense activity in the 1st millennium BCE and the 1st millennium CE. But use is not the same as origin. You can walk into a stone-cut room used as a Byzantine chapel in the 9th century and be unable to say with confidence whether the first cavity in that spot was opened in the 2nd century BCE or the 12th century BCE, or even earlier. Each later community can smooth walls, recut ceilings, widen corridors, erase the sharp edges of earlier work. It's like renovating an old house without leaving the previous floor plan. The Hittite hypothesis rests mostly on context and plausibility. We know the Hittites were active in central Anatolia. We know they dug rock-cut sanctuaries, storage chambers, and defensive works. They lived in a world of constant frontier tension, rival kingdoms, raiders, famines. They certainly had the tools and motives to begin experimenting with underground refuges. But direct Hittite inscriptions in the big underground cities? So far, none. The Phrygian idea leans on the power vacuum that followed the late Bronze Age collapse. This was a time of population movements, insecurity, and new polities forming in old landscapes. Phrygian culture left its mark in monumental tombs and inscriptions elsewhere in Anatolia. It's easy to imagine them reusing or enlarging earlier cavities, or even starting new ones as part of regional defense strategies. Again, though hard, labelled evidence inside the major complexes is thin. Persian period use is easier to see in some places, not always underground, but in the broader archaeological record of Cappadocia. Under the Achaemenids, this region became a frontier satrapy, threaded by royal roads and watched by garrisons. Local elites balanced loyalty to a distant king with the immediate pressures of tax farming, rival clans, and opportunistic raids. If you were a village headman in that era, with caravans passing through and armies occasionally marching by, cutting or enlarging refuge spaces would have been a rational investment. Some pottery and occupation layers in certain complexes do indeed line up with this Persian-dominated time frame. But notice the pattern. Every hypothesis that names a first builder really describes one chapter in a long, layered process. An earlier group might have cut the first rough shelter rooms, low ceilings, minimal ventilation, niches for lamps. A later community, living under a different kingdom with different threats, could come along and deepen the system, add stables, carve better air shafts, and install those great rolling stone doors. Centuries after that, Christians might whiten the walls with plaster, carve crosses, niches and apses, and repurpose some storage spaces as chapels. By the time Romans and then Byzantines were arguing over doctrine and borders, many of the underground spaces we walk through today were probably already palimpsests, older voids recut, connected, abandoned, reopened, and folded into new defensive strategies. This is why the question who started it can mislead us. It assumes a single moment of invention, a flash of genius when one people under one king decided to dig down 18 stories and carve a hidden city. The rock suggests something slower, more cumulative. A habit, not a one-time project. A tradition of going underground, inherited, expanded, and reinterpreted across cultures and centuries. When we shift the question from who built Derinkuyu to who used and reshaped these places, and when, the picture becomes less tidy but more true. We start to see Hittite age farmers, Phrygian herders, Persian-era villagers, Hellenistic traders, Roman peasants, and Byzantine monks, all as participants in the same long experiment in subterranean refuge. And that long experiment doesn't stop with the fall of the last Anatolian kingdom before Rome. In the next stretch of the story, Cappadocia finds itself pulled into a new imperial orbit. Legions, roads, tax registers, and border wars arrive. The underground habit doesn't vanish, it adapts. To follow it forward, we step into the Roman and then the Byzantine eras, where insecurity becomes a way of life, and the old stone shelters below the villages gain new reasons to be used. By the time Rome took formal control of Cappadocia, the idea of going underground was already old. What changed under Rome wasn't the instinct to seek refuge. It was the scale and rhythm of the dangers that made refuge feel necessary. Look at a map and you can see the problem. Cappadocia sits in the middle of Anatolia, but politically it was rarely in the middle of anything. It was on somebody's edge. Under the Persians, it was a frontier satrapy. Under the Hellenistic kingdoms that followed Alexander, it was a buffer between rival dynasties. Under Rome, and later under the Eastern Byzantine Empire, it became part of a long shifting borderland between the Mediterranean world and the powers of the Iranian plateau. Borders like that don't sit still. They breathe in and out. One year the frontier is hundreds of kilometers away, locked in someone else's war. A decade later, armies are marching along the ridge above your village. From a senator's point of view in Rome or Constantinople, Cappadocia was a strategic zone, high plateaus, good horse country, routes that could move legions or supply columns between the Black Sea, Syria, and the central Anatolian plains. From a farmer's point of view, it was more basic. It meant troops on the roads. It meant scouts asking questions. It meant hearing that some king, or some shah, or some usurper you would never see in your life had crossed a river several hundred miles away, and now everyone was nervous. Strategic for them, unsettling for you. Empires try to manage that unease. Rome built forts and watchtowers, dotted garrisons across the landscape, and tied them together with roads. Later, the Byzantines turned some of the same high points into fortified hilltop towns and walled monasteries. Seen from above, the defence system looks rational and impressive. Seen from within a village, you still have a gap to fill. A fort on a hill can't move to stand in front of your barley field when a band of deserters or tax resistors or just hungry men with spears decide your granary looks tempting. A watchtower can light a signal fire, but it can't get your children to safety in the 10 or 20 minutes between rumour and hoofbeats. That's where the underground comes in. An underground refuge doesn't replace forts and alliances. It complements them. You can think of it as the last layer in a stack of defences. At the top layer you have imperial diplomacy and treaties. Far away people deciding, for now, not to invade. Below that you have local alliances, neighbouring villages, clan leaders, monasteries, local magnates who can muster armed followers. They negotiate safe passage, try to keep raiders at bay, sometimes pay them off. Closer still you have walls, towers, maybe a small castle if your district is lucky. And under all of that you have rock. Quiet, patient, indifferent rock that you and your grandparents and their grandparents have slowly hollowed into a place where, if every other layer fails, you can disappear for a while. Not forever, not as a permanent lifestyle, but for the dangerous day, or the bad week, or the anxious season, when soldiers are moving and no one is sure who is in charge. Roman and Byzantine Cappadocia had plenty of those seasons. Border wars, civil wars, usurpations, one emperor marching east to fight a Persian king, another emperor marching west to fight a rival emperor. Each campaign meant roads crowded with troops and supply trains. Each army needed food, fodder, draft animals. Sometimes they paid. Sometimes they requisitioned. Sometimes the difference was mostly in the paperwork. For ordinary families, danger often didn't look like a swirling climactic battle. It looked like being stripped of grain right before winter. It looked like young men vanishing into conscription lines, taken to fill the ranks of some distant legion or thematic regiment. It looked like tax collectors insisting that your village still owed last year's quota, even after hail or drought or locusts. When pressure like that builds, responses become habitual. Banditry, for instance, isn't just a romantic Robin Hood-style phenomenon in the sources. It is often the shadow cast by the state's own actions. Deserters, displaced peasants, followers of defeated warlords, all trying to survive off the same countryside, the official tax system is already squeezing. If you live in a stone house above soft tuff, the logical thing to do is not to wait until the worst year and then frantically start digging. You do a little every generation. You improve the old chambers, widen a passage, connect to the next family's cellar. You cut a narrow, defensible staircase here, a hidden entrance there. You turn, having a place to hide, from a panicked improvisation into a normal part of being a household in a risky landscape. That's where the distinction between short-term and episodic use matters. Most archaeologists think the underground cities weren't year-round towns in the Roman and Byzantine periods. People farmed on the surface, kept animals in above-ground pens, lived in courtyard houses, carved rock-cut rooms up on the slopes. The underworld spaces were for when that routine broke. Sometimes that might mean a single afternoon, a dust cloud on the horizon, horn calls, someone shouting that mounted men are coming down the valley. You grab what you can, drive the small animals toward the closest entrance, roll the door shut behind you, and wait in the dark until the sound of hooves and shouting fades. Sometimes it might mean longer, a campaigning season when both sides in a border war are living off the land, and rumours of looting are constant. In that case, families might shift more of their storage, and even some sleeping arrangements underground for weeks at a time, coming up to work fields in quick, cautious bursts. Danger, in other words, was rarely cinematic. It was more like background noise, an atmosphere. A world where your father tells you calmly where the oil jars are in the refuge room and how to light the lamps, where your grandmother remembers the last time everyone slept below for 3 nights because someone said the taxmen were coming with soldiers, where children grow up knowing that under the floor of the village there is another village, narrower, darker, quieter, waiting. By the Roman and later Byzantine eras, that knowledge seems to have been woven into local life. The same way people learned how to read the clouds for weather, or the soil for planting, they learned to read the political sky. They watched which armies were on the move, which governors were falling out of favour, which border forts had gone silent, and when the omens looked bad, they used the rock. In the next part of the story, this long habit of going below intersects with a new factor, faith. As Christianity spreads and empires change, the underground spaces don't just serve as grain vaults and hiding places. They begin to gather chapels, crosses, and whispered stories of persecution. Stories we have to examine carefully through the same cautious lens we've used for everything else. By the time we reach the high Byzantine centuries, roughly from the 600s onward, one explanation tends to dominate popular accounts of Cappadocia's underground cities: Arab raids. If you read guidebooks or watch quick documentaries, the story often goes like this. Muslim armies and raiding parties push into Byzantine territory, the frontier shifts, Cappadocia is exposed, and Christian villagers scurry underground to hide from the invaders. The soft rock is carved into vast bunkers. Millstone doors roll shut. Lamps are lit. Prayers are whispered. The storm passes overhead. There is a real historical core to that picture. From the early 7th century, the Eastern Roman Empire, what we usually call the Byzantine Empire, loses Syria, Palestine and Egypt to early Islamic armies. The old Roman frontier line collapses. Suddenly the border between Byzantium and the expanding Arab caliphates runs much closer to central Anatolia. For the next 2 or 3 centuries, war along that line becomes almost seasonal. Sources from both sides describe raids and counter-raids, fast-moving cavalry columns riding deep into enemy territory, burning supply depots, attacking small towns, carrying off livestock and captives. Sometimes they aim at big fortresses. Sometimes they simply strip the countryside of whatever it can provide. If you live in Cappadocia in the 8th century, you're not on the very edge of the frontier, but you're also not safely tucked away in the imperial heartland. You're in what military historians call the hinterland of the border. Raiding parties might not come every year, but they come often enough that everyone has heard stories from somewhere only a few days' ride away. In that environment, the logic of concealment becomes sharper. A village cannot stand in the open against a disciplined, well-armed raiding column. Even a small band of experienced horsemen has range, speed and weapons that peasant militia can't match. There's no glorious last stand here, no cinematic battle line. If you resist, you're likely to lose your crops, your animals, and a few of your neighbours. You might also draw harsher reprisals. If you disappear, the raiders may not even bother to look for you. They are on a timetable, after all. Raids are constrained by distance, forage, and the risk of being cut off by counterattacks on the way home. The goal is usually loot, not extermination. A stone-built village that looks deserted, with no smoke from chimneys, no animals in pens, no bodies in the lanes, is a less attractive target than a thriving market town. So concealment isn't just about survival in an immediate sense. It's about making the economics of raiding work against the raiders. That's where warning time and gatekeeping matter. Imagine the system working properly. There are scouts on hills or watchers in towers tied into a wider network of beacons and riders. Maybe the border fort 2 days away has already lit a signal fire that another outpost has seen, and a monk at your local monastery is counting how many days it usually takes trouble to move from there to here. Word filters down long before you hear hoofbeats. You don't wait until the riders are at the edge of the fields. You start a quiet, methodical shift. Grain is moved from above-ground storerooms into deep silos. Water jars are filled, oil, salt, smoked meat, and dried fruit are taken below. Someone checks the ventilation shafts, clears any debris, makes sure the draft is good. Another person inspects the millstone doors. Can they still roll? Do the pegs that lock them hold firm? Then people go down in stages. The oldest and youngest first. Those who can't run if things go wrong. They settle into the inner rooms with lamps, bedding and food. Adults follow with animals that can be moved, sheep, goats, maybe a few chickens. The big draft animals might stay above, quietly driven toward ravines or caves where they can be abandoned if necessary. Finally, someone is last. There has to be a person, or a small group who stays near the surface entrance until the last possible moment, listening to rumours, watching the road, deciding when this has turned from tense to time to vanish. When they go down, they roll the stone, secure the peg, and step into the same darkness as everyone else. From that point on, the whole system depends on planning and on self-control. How long can you keep lamps burning? How fast do you go through air in a crowded chamber? How much noise carries up the ventilation shafts? Do you risk small foraging trips at night if the raiders seem to have moved on, or do you wait until someone above can safely signal that the danger has passed? Archaeologically, you can see how repeated exposure to that kind of threat might shape the rock itself. Earlier, simpler refuges are often shallow, A few rooms, a short staircase, maybe a single ventilation shaft. In later phases that likely overlap with the height of Arab-Byzantine conflict, you see deeper levels, more elaborate circulation patterns, multiple exits and emergency shafts, and serious investment in security features. Narrow, easily defensible corridors where only one person can pass at a time. Offset stairways that force anyone moving through to twist and turn, losing momentum. Blind corners where a defender might wait with a spear. Chambers that seem designed less for comfort and more for stockpiling food and water for a sizable group. It looks like architecture that has been iterated under pressure. A generation shelters once, finds a weak point and fixes it. The raiders came too close to this entrance. Next season, you carve a new, more hidden one. You realize smoke from cooking gave away your position. You extend ventilation shafts or ban fire in certain rooms. You ran short on space or grain. You hollow another level below, using the spoil to patch above-ground walls or build new rock-cut houses on the slopes. Some researchers have tried to line up historical periods of intense conflict with phases of expansion in specific underground cities. They point, for example, to ceramic dates and coin, finds that cluster in the 7th to 10th centuries, and suggest that many of the deeper levels and more complex layouts may belong to that long age of frontier raiding. The evidence is suggestive but not precise. Dating rock-cut architecture is notoriously difficult. Pottery and coins tell you when a space was used, not necessarily when it was first carved. A room might have been dug centuries earlier and only later connected to a deeper complex. A passageway could be widened or narrowed multiple times. Organic materials that could be radiocarbon dated don't always preserve well in these environments. So when people say the Byzantines dug these cities to hide from Arab raids, they're summarizing a more tangled reality. Yes, the period of Arab-Byzantine conflict almost certainly saw intense use of the underground spaces. Yes, some expansion and deepening probably happened in direct response to those pressures. But the core habit of going underground is older, and the rock remembers more than one kind of enemy. Still, if you stood in a lamplit corridor in the 8th century, pressed against the wall, while hooves clattered faintly somewhere above, the wider history would not matter much. You would be living the most common explanation in its rawest form. This is a refuge from riders on the surface. And over time that repeated act of retreat, families going below, doors closing, voices dropping to whispers, would leave its mark not only in stone but in memory. Grandparents telling children about the last raid, parents teaching exactly how many steps it is from the entrance to the nearest water jar in pitch black, stories of saints and soldiers woven together with accounts of close escapes. That is the world in which later legends about persecution and secret worship take shape. A world where hiding becomes not an exception, but a recurring part of life. In the next section, we'll follow those legends down into the chapels and crosses carved into the tuff, and ask how much of the persecution story is history and how much is the echo of long, anxious nights underground. If you've ever taken a tour of an underground city, you've probably heard the next version of the story. Not just we hid from raids, but we hid from persecution. The lights dim a little, the guide gestures toward a small rock-cut chapel, and the story shifts from cavalry and frontiers to faith and fear. Early Christians, we are told, fled down here to escape Roman soldiers. Or later, Orthodox villagers hid from Muslim authorities. Or still later, local minorities used these tunnels as secret churches, whispering prayers the state would not allow. It's a powerful image. It connects stone corridors to moral drama, brave believers versus hostile empires. But as with most powerful images, we have to step carefully. There are a few things we can say with reasonable confidence. People did pray down here. They carved crosses, apse like niches, simple altars, even entire miniature churches with columns and painted saints. The underground world wasn't just a pantry and a panic room. It was also a place where liturgy and story and memory were kept alive, and there were times and places in Cappadocia's long history when specific groups absolutely faced real danger because of their beliefs, or because of the way those beliefs lined up with politics. But that's not quite the same as saying, these cities were built for persecuted Christians, or this whole labyrinth exists because of secret worship. That's the leap we have to resist. First, the Roman piece of the story. Popular accounts often imagine large numbers of Christians hiding underground from Roman crackdowns in the first 3 centuries CE. The problem is, the archaeology doesn't really line up with that picture. Most of the clearly Christian decoration in Cappadocia's underground spaces dates to later Byzantine periods, when Christianity was the official religion of the empire, not a banned cult. Could Christians in the earlier Roman era have used simple underground refuges to avoid trouble during a local pogrom or a tense moment with authorities? It's possible people hide wherever they can, but we don't have solid, direct evidence tying the earliest phases of these huge complexes to organised empire-wide persecution campaigns. Then there's the Islamic period. Here too, the story gets streamlined, Christian villagers hiding from an oppressive Muslim state. The real record is more complicated. For long stretches, Cappadocian Christians lived as recognised communities under Muslim rulers, paying taxes, maintaining churches, negotiating status. That doesn't mean life was easy or equal, but it also doesn't mean constant, uniform terror driving whole populations permanently underground. More often, what we can see is a pattern of sporadic local danger layered onto a background of uneasy coexistence. A raid that got out of hand, a corrupt official demanding extra payments, tension between neighbouring villages. Religious difference could sharpen those conflicts, provide language for them, make them feel cosmic. But the trigger might be as much about land, taxes, or loyalty as about theology. In that kind of world, underground spaces make sense less as permanent catacombs of persecution and more as flexible tools for communities on the margins. If your village sits off the main road, if you belong to a minority confession, if you've backed the wrong faction in a church dispute, if the governor in the distant city dislikes your bishop, your risk profile is different. You're not necessarily the target of an emperor's grand policy, but you might very well be the first to suffer when something flares. For those people, an underground complex is a way to lower visibility. You don't declare rebellion. You don't stand in the square and defy the authorities. You make sure that when a patrol rides by or a hostile neighbour makes accusations, there's less to see. Fewer bodies in the open, fewer gatherings that look suspicious, more of daily life, prayer, meetings, teaching, folded discreetly into the rock. Over time, as the original reasons blur, stories simplify. Generations who knew the specific names, the harsh tax collector, the jealous local commander, the rival village, die off. What remains are patterns. We went underground when they came. We prayed in secret. We weren't allowed to worship as we wished. The they becomes Rome, or the Turks, or the Muslims, or the emperor, depending on who is telling the story centuries later. The details compress into a single word: persecution. Modern nationalism and modern tourism both encourage this compression. A simple, heroic explanation is easier to remember, easier to market, and easier to fit into our own sense of right and wrong. Underground cities built by persecuted Christians is a cleaner headline than multifunctional refuges repeatedly reused over many centuries by villagers facing a mix of military, fiscal, and sometimes religious pressure. But when we strip away the complexity, we also lose the real textures of fear and creativity that shaped these places. So a more balanced way to read the evidence might be this. Conflict on the surface, sometimes religious, sometimes not, pushed people to invest in underground infrastructure. As Christianity spread and later became dominant in the region, those spaces naturally took on a Christian character. Chapels and symbols tell us that worship happened there, and at times worship may have been quieter or more cautious than it was above ground. Yet the same corridors that echoed with hymns also stored grain, sheltered animals, and channeled smoke. The same rooms that held icons could, on another day, hold water jars or sleeping children. Secret worship is part of the story, but not the whole story. If you drift down those narrow stairways in your imagination, you can let both truths coexist. A family hiding from riders they can hear, but not see. A priest chanting in a soot-dark chapel because going above feels unsafe. And also, on more ordinary nights, villagers lighting candles here simply because it's cool in summer, warm in winter, and this is where their community is always gathered when the world outside feels unsettled. The rock doesn't tell us why in a single sentence. It just holds the marks of many different whys laid one over another. In the next section, we'll step back from human enemies entirely and ask whether some of those whys might have nothing to do with armies or empires at all, but with something more patient and indifferent: the weather, the harvest, and the long memory of bad years. If you grow up in a landscape like Cappadocia, you don't just learn the names of your neighbours and the nearest town. You learn the moods of the sky. You notice which ravines keep a trace of snow the longest, which plateaus burn dry by June, which winds mean a storm that will pass, and which winds mean a week of hard, cold rain that flattens grain and turns roads to mud. People here lived with a kind of double awareness: the visible danger of riders and armies, and the slower, quieter danger of weather drifting out of balance. So could these underground spaces have been in part an answer to that second kind of fear? The rock itself suggests it might. Even without thinking of enemies, there are obvious reasons to go down. Underground, temperatures hold steady. The summer sun can't scorch your stored food. Winter frost can't get at buried grain. Wine ferments more predictably. Vegetables keep longer in cool rock-cut cellars than in any wooden shed exposed to the wind. Across the ancient world, people learned this. In the Near East and Central Asia, families dug storage pits for grain, sometimes lined with plaster, sometimes capped with stone lids. In the American Southwest, ancestral Puebloans tucked food into rock crevices and masonry rooms, protected from sun and rodents. In Northern Europe, farmers carved earth cellars and rock-cut caves to keep root vegetables through long winters. Cappadocia's underground rooms can be read as an extension of that same logic, just taken to an unusual scale. Imagine a village that has seen bad years. A late frost wipes out the apricot blossom. A summer comes with almost no rain, and the thin soils of the volcanic plateau crack open. The next year is a little better, but not enough to erase the memory of empty granaries and thin children. If you have soft rock under your feet, and iron or bronze tools in your hands, digging extra storage starts to feel less like a luxury and more like insurance. Some of the cities we marvel at today may have grown, layer by layer, from very ordinary beginnings. A stable carved into the slope, a few cool rooms for jars, a passage connecting two households. Only later, as threats multiplied, did those functional spaces get integrated into larger defensive systems. Could people actually ride out a famine or a brutal winter down there? To a degree, yes, if they had prepared for it. Underground, you're protected from heat waves and cold snaps. You can smooth out temperature extremes. You can ration grain, dry fruit, salted meat in carefully guarded storerooms. You can share water from a well that's harder to foul or steal. But there are limits. The airflow that keeps you alive also carries moisture and disease. Animal stables below ground save your herd from a blizzard, but they also fill the air with ammonia and parasites. Without constant fuel, light and cooking become expensive in terms of labour. And most importantly, the food you have is the food you brought. Rock doesn't grow wheat. It's more plausible to picture the underground as a place for short, intense retreats, days, maybe a few weeks at a time, than as a bunker for multi-year climate disasters. When you compare Cappadocia to other cultures, that pattern holds. In many societies, people built emergency shelters, storm cellars in tornado country, snow caves in Arctic regions, pit houses partially sunk into the ground for insulation. These were used seasonally or episodically, not as permanent, full-time homes. The Cappadocian complexes could function like that on a grander, more communal scale. A whole village, or several linked hamlets, might move largely below ground during a particularly harsh stretch. A winter of raids and blizzards, a summer of heat and banditry, a plague year when limiting contact with outsiders felt wise. Still, when you look closely at the architecture, something stands out. The very features that make sense for storms or cold, thick rock walls, few external openings, are also arranged in ways that make particular sense for human threat. Narrow choke points where only one person can pass at a time. False corridors that lead to dead ends. Rolling stone doors designed to be closed from the inside, pinning attackers in tight, unfamiliar spaces. Deep shafts that double as ventilation and as vertical escape routes. Those are not things you need to keep out a drought. They speak to an intelligence that expected thinking enemies, people who could probe for weaknesses, force doors, smoke out chambers. You don't carve elaborate kill zones for the wind, so a balanced reading might be this. Climate and weather made underground life attractive. Stable temperatures, secure storage, protection from sudden storms, and the exhausting swing of seasons, all of that pushed people to invest in the rock. Years of poor harvests and remembered famines would have increased the pressure to create reliable, hidden reserves. If you knew from your grandparents' stories that 3 bad years could come in a row, you dug a little deeper. But once you've built that infrastructure, once you have tunnels and rooms and cellars beneath the village, it's almost inevitable that you'll also adapt them for defense against your most unpredictable predator, other humans. That dual use, shelter from sky and shelter from swords, probably shifted over time, with different generations emphasizing different fears. And here again, we run into the temptation to over-explain. It's appealing to say, these cities were built because of climate crisis, or they are famine bunkers, in the same way it's appealing to say, they are monuments to persecution, or they are pure military fortresses. Each single cause story is neat. It promises closure. The rock, as usual, is messier. We see signs of storage and signs of siege, traces of seasonal use and hints of longer stays. We know Cappadocia's climate has swung between wetter and drier phases, harsher and milder centuries. We know people everywhere are shaped by what they fear most, and that those fears change. Beyond that, certainty thins out. So instead of choosing one explanation, we can let several sit side by side. Bad winters, failed harvests, scorching summers, bandit bands, tax collectors, border wars. All of them nudging the same decision: dig. And as we move into the next section, where myths and modern theories swirl around these caverns, it helps to keep that humility in mind. When evidence is thin and the desire for a dramatic answer is strong, that's exactly when we should slow down, breathe, and remember that sometimes the truest story is the one that refuses to be simple. Once you admit that the truth is layered, something else creeps in through the cracks. Big stories. If you've ever gone online and typed Cappadocia underground city, you've seen them. Claims that Derinkuyu was built by refugees from Atlantis, or by a lost civilization with technology we can't replicate, or by visitors from the stars dropping in with rock melting rays and handing out ventilation diagrams like party favours. These theories aren't just random noise, they tell us something about us. Faced with a place that is both vast and half understood, our brains reach for explanations that feel as large as the mystery. 18 levels deep, space for tens of thousands of people, tunnels stretching for kilometres under a landscape that already looks like the set of someone else's dream. It feels like the kind of thing that ought to have a single dramatic origin story. And if the real story is slow, generational, and full of missing pieces, it's tempting to swap it for a clean narrative. One vanished empire, one great catastrophe, one master plan. Scale invites that. We're used to thinking of ordinary people as building houses, maybe barns, not entire subterranean worlds. When we see something that exceeds our sense of what regular villagers can do, we mentally upgrade the builders into something else. Atlanteans, hidden priest kings, off-world engineers. But there's another way to read that same scale. Not as evidence of a one-time miracle, but as the sum of hundreds of small, understandable decisions repeated over centuries. A family carves a cellar into the tuff for their wine and grain. Their neighbours, impressed, copy the idea. After a bad year of raids, a few households connect their basements with a corridor so they can move hidden between them. A century later, their descendants widen that corridor, add a stable, sink a shaft to tap a better water source. Another few generations, and someone links this cluster to the next valley over. Each step is modest. The total, taken over many lifetimes, looks like a marvel. Archaeology all over the world shows the same pattern. Cliff dwellings that began as a few storage rooms. Hill forts that started as simple palisades around one house. Cathedral-sized temples that rose stone by stone from the offerings of thousands of anonymous hands. Cappadocia fits comfortably into that pattern. Incremental expansion, reuse of older spaces, regional know-how spreading from village to village. So how do we tell the difference between a good story and a grounded explanation? One way is time. Claims about Atlanteans or aliens often quietly skip the basics of dating. We don't just guess when these spaces were used. We look at soot on the ceilings and date it with radiocarbon. We analyse pottery left in trash pits. We compare tool marks to known periods of metal technology. We match inscriptions and wall carvings to scripts and languages whose timelines we already know. When those lines of evidence cluster around the first millennium BCE through the Byzantine period, and not around some imagined Ice Age super-civilization, that matters. Another way is logistics. If a theory suggests a workforce so advanced it could laser carve an underground metropolis in a single project, you can ask, where's the corresponding surface evidence? Where are the quarries, the metal foundries, the road systems, the garbage dumps you'd expect from a high-energy, high-tech society? What we actually see in Cappadocia are hand tool marks in soft volcanic rock. Rooms that sometimes ignore perfect symmetry because the stone dictated the shape. Entrances that have been modified, blocked, reopened. Layers of plaster and smoke that speak of many rebuilds. Not a single finished blueprint. Comparative archaeology helps too. Other regions with similar geology show similar solutions. In central Italy, people carved Etruscan and Roman rock-cut tombs and cellars into tuff. In Malta, communities dug elaborate hypogeia and refuge caves. In parts of China, Yodong cave dwellings honeycomb Los cliffs, housing millions even in recent times. None of these required lost empires. They required local stone that was soft when cut and hardened with air simple iron tools and traditions passed down. That doesn't make them less astonishing, it makes them more human. And that's the balance to hold. We don't have to strip Cappadocia of its mystery to be careful about misinformation. It is still wild to stand in a chamber, deep underground, and realize that above you are houses, and above those fields, and above those stars. It is still eerie to imagine flickering lamps behind stone doors, children whispered to silence, whole communities waiting in the dark for danger to pass. We can keep that sense of wonder, even lean into it, while being honest about the limits of what we know, and the techniques we use to go a little further. And if you enjoy walking that line between mystery and evidence, there's more waiting when you're awake. We've put together a book on 12 of history's most intriguing unexplained sites and events, the ones that sit in that same grey zone between legend and archaeology. You can find it on the website linked in the description, and this week there's a discount for viewers of this channel. For now, though, you're still under Cappadocia. You've heard the myths, aliens, Atlanteans, secret empires hiding from cosmic wars. You've seen how much of the real story can be told with soot, stone chips, broken pots, and careful comparisons. What remains is quieter, but in some ways deeper. These underground cities are not the work of gods or visitors from beyond the stars. They are the fossilized traces of ordinary people behaving extraordinarily, over and over, because their world kept giving them reasons to adapt. In the next section, we'll follow the story upward again into the centuries when those reasons began to fade, the rock chambers emptied, and the great experiment in living below ground slowly came to an end. The end didn't come with a proclamation. No one in Cappadocia gathered the village elders, lit a ceremonial fire, and announced, "We, the people of Derinkuyu, hereby resolve to stop living underground." It was slower than that, softer, more like a habit wearing thin. Remember that these spaces were, above all, tools. Tools for dealing with a particular kind of world, unstable frontiers, raiding armies, sudden religious crackdowns, local feuds that might turn deadly without much warning. When those pressures changed, the logic of spending weeks in the dark changed too. As the Byzantine Empire consolidated its control, some stretches of Anatolia became more tightly administered. Garrisons increased, tax systems stabilized, and imperial roads made troop movements faster and more predictable. A strong central state could be brutal, but it tended to be more regular. You could at least guess when the danger might come. Later, under the Seljuks and then the Ottomans, patterns shifted again. Islamized powers became the dominant military force. Fortified caravanserais, surface fortresses, and walled towns increasingly handled defence. Warfare began to revolve more around controlling roads, passes, and castle-topped hills than flushing villagers out of rabbit warren refuges. And weapons changed. When raiders were mostly on horseback with swords and spears, a hidden, defensible warren in the rock was an excellent answer. Once siege engines, organised artillery, and later firearms became widespread. The focus of conflict moved upward and outward, toward fortified citadels and open fields where armies could manoeuvre and supply lines mattered. In that context, spending months carving new levels underground stopped being the obvious investment. Imagine you're a farmer in the 13th century. Your grandparents tell stories about spending whole seasons under the earth during Arab-Byzantine raids. They remember the fear, the cramped sleeps, the smoky air. But your own children have mostly known tax collectors, not war bands. The Sultan's law is harsh, but raiders from 3 empires away aren't crashing through your village every spring. You still maintain the entrance to your ancestral refuge. You keep some supplies down there. Maybe you go underground for a few nights when rumours of trouble sweep through. But do you organise your neighbours to dig a new gallery 10 metres deeper? Probably not. Instead, the Underworld begins to specialise. Parts of it remain, occasionally, what they always were, places to vanish when danger feels close. Ottoman records and travellers' accounts suggest that even into the early modern period, villagers in Cappadocia sometimes retreated into caves and basements during bandit attacks or local conflict. But other levels quietly take on different roles. Cool, stable underground rooms are perfect for storing grain, wine, oil, and dried fruit. In a hot, dry climate, a chamber carved into tuff is a natural refrigerator. Some spaces that were once sleeping quarters in emergencies become year-round cellars. You go down not because you're hiding, but because you're checking the barrels. Some side passages become workshops. It's easier to chip stone troughs or millstones right there in the rock. Tunnels give you shade to weave, to cure cheese, to press grapes, to do the messy work of village life without baking in the sun. Other corners draw a different kind of inhabitant entirely. In the Christian tradition, Cappadocia becomes famous for its monastic communities, hermits and monks seeking a life apart. They carve rock-cut churches and simple cells into valley walls, but some also adapt older underground spaces. A chamber that once held a crowded, anxious family might, centuries later, hold a solitary monk chanting psalms in the half-dark, using isolation as a doorway not to safety, but to contemplation. In all these phases, people are reusing what they inherited, not fully understanding every tunnel that extends beyond their own needs. And then there is simple neglect. Without regular traffic, stone is not timeless. The tuff of Cappadocia is soft. It fractures along hidden lines. A supporting pillar erodes or is cut back to widen a room. The ceiling, no longer properly braced, drops in slow motion over decades. Winter freezes swell tiny cracks into larger ones. Heavy rain infiltrates from above, dissolving minerals, turning some ceilings crumbly, slumping floors into uneven waves. Levels close themselves, piece by piece. A corridor fills with fallen rock, and villagers stop using it. An upper entrance collapses in a storm, sealing the stair below like a cork. Elsewhere, people do the ceiling on purpose, blocking side tunnels with masonry because they feel unsafe, or because those passages now belong symbolically to the old times and no longer fit into ordinary life. Water plays its part too. Some underground cities were careful about tapping controlled aquifers and protecting wells from contamination. But hydrology shifts. Earthquakes open new pathways for groundwater. An underground chamber that was once comfortably dry becomes damp, then muddy, then fills like a cistern. A lower level may turn into a seasonal sump, making it useless or even dangerous to enter. Over 1,000 years or more, an intricate multi-level complex can be reduced, in practical terms, to just a handful of accessible rooms. The rest persists as rumour. There used to be tunnels under the village. My grandfather said there was a deep place we don't go. By the time modern archaeology and tourism arrive, what survives is a jigsaw with missing pieces. Preserving those pieces is its own challenge. Once you invite thousands of visitors a year into a fragile rock maze, you change its environment. Electric lighting dries and warms the air, breath and body heat add moisture. Foot traffic polishes floors, wears down thresholds, rubs at carved details that were already worn by centuries of use. To keep ceilings from falling, engineers add supports. To prevent accidents, they widen stairs, lower uneven thresholds, install railings where once there were just rough handholds carved into stone. To make routes clear, they sometimes open new passages between rooms that were never connected that way. Each intervention is understandable. Many are necessary. But little by little, the underground city you walk through today becomes a hybrid, partly original, partly restored, partly reimagined in the name of safety and interpretation. Fresh tool marks from the 1970s sit next to chisel scars from perhaps the Romans. Cement and steel discreetly shoulder loads that used to be carried by raw rock. For historians, this creates a delicate problem. Stabilizing a site makes it possible to study and share. Over-stabilizing risks rewriting the evidence, smoothing out the irregularities that might have told us how people really moved, where they really slept, which doorways were choked with soot and which weren't. It's why careful documentation matters. Laser scans, measured drawings, photographs, so that even as we alter the present reality of the site, we retain some record of the previous state, the one that time and villagers and quiet abandonment had produced. What then still speaks clearly through all this layering of use, neglect, and restoration? Fear, certainly, but not only fear. The underground cities of Cappadocia have long since lost their original strategic edge. No one is going to roll a millstone door shut against an approaching cavalry charge now. Yet the very fact that the spaces are still here, in any form, teaches something about the people who once needed them. They were planners, not in the modern sense of maps and spreadsheets, but in their bones. Generations who assumed that danger would come again, even if they didn't know when or from where. People who were willing to carve contingency plans into stone, literally embedding backup options into the earth beneath their homes. They were also pragmatists. As soon as the worst dangers receded, they turned those same carved refuges into storerooms, workshops, monastic cells. They refused to let hard-won space go to waste, even if its original purpose had faded, and they were resilient in a way that doesn't always make it into grand narratives. Not the resilience of one heroic stand, but of many small adjustments, going under when the world burned overhead, coming out when it quieted, retooling the same chambers for whatever the next century demanded. When you drift towards sleep thinking of these places, you don't have to solve the mystery of exactly who first dug which tunnel, or whether all the levels of any one complex were ever fully occupied at once. Much of that will probably remain uncertain. What is clear is the pattern. A landscape that invited people downward, centuries that pushed them to take that invitation seriously. Slowly changing politics and warfare that made it less necessary to live like moles. Then a long afterlife of reuse, collapse, forgetting, and rediscovery. On the surface, the story ends with abandonment. But under that, as steady as the rock itself, is a quieter message. When faced with forces you can't control, invading armies, shifting empires, harsh seasons, one answer is to cut your own margin of safety into the world, however you can. For the people of Cappadocia, that meant 18 or 8, or however many stories of darkness and preparation beneath their feet. For us, those silent levels are less about what they feared and more about how far they were willing to go. Not to escape the world, but to stay alive in it, long enough to see the danger pass and the light return. So what were they hiding from, really? If you gather up all the clues we've walked through, the narrow choke points, the rolling stone doors, the deep ventilation shafts, the way access could be sealed from the inside, a pattern comes into focus. These weren't primarily cozy underground villages built for fun or for year-round living. They were defensive machines. Most archaeologists lean toward a core explanation that sounds simple on the surface: security. Refuge. A place to vanish when the world above became unpredictable. Not just once, but again and again. Border wars, tax revolts, raids from rival empires, local feuds that got out of hand, religious crackdowns that made public worship dangerous for a season. Not one single enemy, but a revolving cast of threats, changing with each century, all pointing people toward the same answer: down. The underground cities look like the physical memory of that lesson. At the same time, the evidence won't quite let us flatten it into a single, clean story. Dating the earliest levels is hard. We see hints of pre-Christian use, maybe Hittite, maybe later. We see Christian chapels layered onto older circulation routes. We see Ottoman-era graffiti scratched into walls that might have been first carved 1,000 years before. Was every level in every period about hiding? Probably not. Some chambers were clearly for storage from the start. Others became workshops. Some may have been dug because a well was needed, or because a family wanted a cool room for wine, and the passage just happened to connect into an older complex. There may have been times when generations used only 1 or 2 levels as emergency refuges and knew the deeper ones mostly as stories. So when we ask, what were they hiding from? The most honest answer is layered. They were hiding from the immediate danger of the year they were living through. And they were also hiding from something more timeless. The feeling that power lived elsewhere, that decisions about war and peace were being made far away, that the safest way to endure was to make yourself, for a little while, invisible. Think of the patience that requires planning, not in hours or days, but in lifetimes. You carve the tunnels knowing that the danger you're preparing for might never come in your own years, or knowing that if it does, it might be your grandchildren who find themselves filing down those stairs, counting the sleeping niches you hollowed by lamplight. There's a psychology to concealment that clings to these places. The discipline of staying quiet when instinct says to panic. The trust it takes to file past your neighbours in single file. Children pressed close, livestock restless, and believe that rock walls and stone doors will be enough. The knowledge that when the last millstone thuds into its socket you have taken yourself off the board for a while, no longer visible to whomever is riding past above, but also entirely dependent on your own foresight. We can reconstruct some of it from architecture and ash layers and tool marks, but a great deal of what it felt like to hide there remains out of reach. And maybe that's fitting. These were spaces designed to keep secrets. As you're listening now, maybe late at night, maybe somewhere between waking and sleep, you're part of the latest layer in that story. People once whispered in those tunnels. Now you're hearing about them through headphones, in a bedroom, on a couch, on a night train. If you'd like to keep wandering through deep time, there's a book I put together on the website, linked in the description. A quiet dive into 12 prehistoric secrets that shaped our species long before anyone carved Cappadocia's rock. It pairs well with this kind of listening, slow, speculative, gentle. When you have a moment, I'd love to hear your theory. If you had to choose, what do you think weighed most heavily on the minds of the first people who dug down? Raids? Persecution? Famine? Something else entirely? Tell me in the comments and let me know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there as this reaches you. If this helped you drift a little closer to sleep, or just gave your mind a calmer place to wander, you can help this kind of history find more people by liking the video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing for more slow, careful journeys into the past. For now, picture the last family stepping through the low doorway. The animals are inside, the stores are stacked. A few lamps flicker. Somewhere near the entrance, hands grip the inner edge of a stone disc and lean their weight into it. The millstone door rolls slow and heavy into place. Air threads gently through the tall, hidden shafts. Footsteps fade along the passages above. The world keeps moving, armies, empires, seasons, without quite knowing who is sleeping, quietly far below. And the underground city, sealed and prepared, breathes in the dark.